This tragic narrative centers on its protagonist, a man identified as the Hound of the Baskerville family. He faced a death sentence after being charged with associating with demonic forces. However, just as his life was about to be extinguished, Vicar swore he would return to claim his vengeance. In a turn of events that seemed like a divine intervention in his destiny, he opened his eyes to find he had journeyed back into his own past. The leader of the Baskerville house, Patriarch Hugo, was the father of numerous offspring. Out of all his descendants, though, only Vicar captured his interest. The young boy quickly understood that he had traveled back to a point when he was merely an infant. In his previous life, he had served as one of the family's hounds, a devoted guardian to his kin. The sole reason for a Baskerville hound's existence is to elevate the family's power, aiming to establish it as the most dominant in the empire. Ultimately, however, his life was cut short by Hugo's own hand. Vicar now possessed an opportunity to alter the course of history. A decree from Hugo saw that Vicar was moved to the Cradle of Swords, a unique environment. A brutal trial awaits every child born into the Baskerville lineage. They must make their way to the river Styx. This enchanted river bestows extraordinary abilities upon the children, but surviving its potent waters is a truly remarkable accomplishment. Vicar had failed to obtain the coveted power from the river in his past life. On this occasion, he was determined to harness the full potential of the Styx's might. For a whole 7 minutes, Vicar withstood the river's force, a feat far surpassing any who came before him. He went so far as to ingest a mouthful of the magical liquid. Hugo, who was observing the event, felt a sense of satisfaction for the very first time. His son demonstrated not just resilience, but also a voracious appetite for life and power. In the boy, the patriarch recognized the qualities of a true successor. Let's explore the protagonist's previous life in a bit more detail. He was Hugo's illegitimate offspring. By the time he was 8, his remarkable abilities had already earned him the label of a genius. He was undertaking assassination and spy missions at the age of 12, and by 30 he was battling monsters during the Age of Destruction. When he turned 40, the great war between demons and humans finally drew to a close. It was at this moment, however, that he was betrayed, branded a traitor, and rewarded for his years of loyalty with an execution. Things are entirely different now. Not only did Vicar endure the river Styx, but he also managed to absorb its energy. Yet danger confronted him almost immediately after. An unknown assailant had secreted 2 venomous snakes near his bed. He handled the threat with complete composure, showing no signs of fear. It appears the Baskerville family is willing to resort to any measure to eliminate heirs it deems superfluous. 8 years went by, during which Vicar pursued his studies at the estate alongside the other children of the clan. His brothers gave him constant trouble. He remembered them all too well from his past existence. They were Hugo's triplets, the very same ones who had betrayed him with a knife in the back. In another decade, they're fated to become his greatest adversaries. Vicar resolved to put them in their place much sooner this time around. The triplets were known for their violent tendencies. Their curiosity was piqued. They wanted to test the rumor that Vicar could actually hold his breath underwater for 7 minutes. The outcome was predictable, confirming the truth. But it came with a surprising twist. One of the brothers lost a finger in the process. Vicar understood that this was merely the start of things. One must see the game through to its conclusion. It didn't take long for the triplets to grasp that the tales about Vicar were all true. He was indeed the Baskerville family's own little monster. The protagonist laid down a chilling condition for them. Only one would be allowed to walk away unscathed. Those words served as a pivotal moment, altering the trajectory of their relationship. The triplets' bond started to fracture as each one scrambled to ensure their own survival. Soon, however, the young men of Baskerville Manor were scheduled for a practical examination. Meanwhile, news of the fight between the boys reached the patriarch. The triplets' injuries were quite severe, and though they were healed, their feud with Vicar was far from over. This is what led to the hero being summoned to the patriarch's office. Hugo wanted to ascertain if his son comprehended the nature of his transgression. He had, after all, beaten his brothers who were a full year his senior. The triplets had suffered wounds that were not just physical, but emotional as well. Vicar's response was straightforward. He was the stronger one. Since he emerged victorious, how could it be considered a mistake? Furthermore, the triplets had already visited the patriarch and magnanimously offered their forgiveness to Vicar. The boy himself, however, felt not a shred of remorse. He held a firm belief that forgiveness is a luxury for the weak who are unable to seek revenge. These words left Hugo utterly astonished. He came to understand that his son had grasped the foundational principle of the Baskerville family. The patriarch instructed his butler to grant the child permission to select any single item from the family's private storeroom. An overjoyed vicar had a simple desire. He only wished to claim some chocolate. As a parting command, Hugo told his son to give his all in the upcoming exam. He was not to be outdone by the direct heirs of the family. The young man's hatred for the one who had killed him in a past life only intensified. Regarding his reward, the boy ultimately selected not chocolate, but something called pure bloody beans. His intention for them wasn't consumption, however. This peculiar delicacy was needed for an exam set to occur in 5 days. It's on that day that a terrible event is destined to unfold, a catastrophe the likes of which the Baskerville family has never experienced. In this world, the Baskerville family is also referred to as the Berserker family. Children in this clan undergo a grueling training regimen from their earliest years. They are forced to scale mountains almost as soon as they can walk. This torturous training period concludes upon their 8th birthday. Following this is the pivotal moment, a survival examination. On the designated day, all the young hounds convene near the Red and Black Mountains. They're given a straightforward objective: survive in this territory for an entire month. Their survival depends on their ability to hunt massive and powerful monsters. Venturing beyond the designated exam area is strongly discouraged, as the Red and Black Mountains are largely uncharted lands filled with unknown dangers. This was a prospect that only pleased Vicar. It had been a long while since he'd been in these parts, and he almost felt a sense of nostalgia for them. The moment the bell tolled to signal the start, the hounds dispersed in every direction. While killing fellow participants isn't forbidden, it does result in a deduction of points. Consequently, everyone attempts to proceed with caution. Maintaining order within the zone is a group of shadow dogs, warriors specially trained to minimize lethal confrontations. A member of the shadow dogs was assigned to tail Vikir. He couldn't help but wonder why the boy was making his way toward the forbidden zone. The protagonist located a comfortable spot and, rather than jumping straight into combat, chose to take a rest. He constructed a shelter and began to establish a camp for himself, while the other young hounds were fighting for their very lives. The observing shadow dog was amazed. Could it be that this boy, already lauded as a genius, was simply going to hide out in the forest? He eventually concluded that continuing to follow the boy was pointless. Finally alone, Vicar let out a sigh of relief. The initial phase of his plan was now complete. It was time to begin the real hunt. After a few days, he had positioned himself deep within the restricted territory. Back when Vicar was a scout, he had navigated these lands with ease. A sharp, burning scent hung in the air here. This was the sign that he was heading in the correct direction. A hellhound made its home here. This was a Sentinel-class monster that fed on hellfire itself. Previously, an 18-year-old Vicar had barely managed to defeat such a creature. Even now, the prospect of victory seemed like a distant dream. Nevertheless, he possessed a trusted strategy, and I'm sure you're wondering what this young boy had devised. The monster's most glaring vulnerability was its linear movement. This characteristic made it difficult for the beast to change its path suddenly. A second weakness was rather peculiar. Even a small quantity of water would startle it. The creature's final vulnerability, one it shared with all canine monsters, was its habit of running with its mouth wide open. Vicar exploited this final trait to its fullest potential. He successfully tossed the poison directly down the creature's throat. This wasn't just any poison, it was chocolate, in substance that all canines feared immensely. And for any monster, the bloody beans used to create this chocolate spelled certain doom. This was the method Vicar used to eliminate his first monster in the exam. Vicar didn't forget to absorb the creature's life force to enhance his own strength. He was just about to claim the hellhound's head as a trophy. At that moment, however, a whole pack of hounds from hell itself suddenly surrounded him. But then something occurred that terrified even these monstrous beasts. This was the very thing our hero had been dreading. Before him stood Cerberus. This particular monster possessed an extremely high danger rating and resided on a different mountain ridge. Vicar, however, spotted wounds covering its body. It appeared that the barbarian tribes in the vicinity had attempted to slay this monster. This Vicar understood was his opportunity. He had concealed his true capabilities for a long time at the Baskerville estate. Vicar had already mastered the family's third sword technique, which we'll examine more closely shortly. To put it briefly, other hounds didn't achieve this level of skill until they were past 18 years of age. There was no doubt that Vicar was a genius, capable of holding his own against a genuine Cerberus. But out here, a single extra second of hesitation could be fatal. If anyone else had been in this situation, they would already be a corpse. Can Vicar emerge victorious? We shall discover the answer later. Vicar eventually came to his senses, but his situation was dire. His hand was gravely wounded, and Cerberus showed no signs of letting up. Our protagonist, however, quickly devised an escape from this predicament. He broke into a sprint, desperately trying to reach the shelter he had prepared earlier. If the monster were to catch him before he reached it, it would spell his end. Vicar finally made it to his base of operations. It was there that Cerberus ran right into a series of prepared traps. The primary assault came from spears and pits that had been smeared with the essence of blood beans. The poison took effect immediately since Cerberus was of the canine type. Even in death, however, this was no ordinary monster. It was a high-ranking demon. Nevertheless, a well-aimed strike with a poisoned spear sealed its fate. Vicar could feel energy radiating from the monster's corpse. Before he could deal with the carcass, though, there was one more critical task he needed to finish. Cerberus served as a guardian, protecting its territory. This implied that a dungeon filled with treasure had to be somewhere nearby. With the guardian now dead, the dungeon was accessible. Tracking the monster using his unique skills, Vicar arrived at the correct location. But what kind of treasures lay concealed within the dungeon? Veins of ruby illuminated the tunnel, a phenomenon that was both captivating and astonishing. Far more unnerving, however, was the brilliant light emanating from the tunnel's end. And so Vicar reached the dungeon's main chamber. A quick survey of the room made one thing clear. Someone had been here before, though it was a very long time ago. An ancient note was resting beside a skeleton. The tale it told was quite compelling, so I'll recount it for you. This letter's purpose was to serve as a warning for future generations, hoping to keep them from making the same errors. The stone cave had been dismissed as a mere legend, but two brothers stumbled upon it by chance and began their joint conquest. They finally reached the place's ultimate trial after slaying a great number of monsters. They remained stuck at this point for 3 entire years. Vicar realized that the final test was waiting for him in this very chamber. The rules could be read under the ruby glow. Upon entry, you are 1, while inside you are 2, and upon leaving, you are 1 again. The brothers read this text over and over, but their interpretation led them to a horrifying conclusion. Only one of them could depart the dungeon with the treasure. A fight ensued, and one of the brothers perished. Yet even after this, the situation remained unchanged. The survivor ultimately decided to abandon the place. Vicar knew with certainty that they had simply misinterpreted the task's instructions. This was because a dungeon that cannot be cleared simply does not exist. The hero quickly grasped the riddle's meaning. He is a single entity as he moves through the dark corridor. Light, however, gives birth to a shadow, and if that light is extinguished, the final challenge will commence. It turned out that Vicar was correct. The brothers' demise was a result of their failure to comprehend the nature of this place. The very relic of the Devil's Cave proved to be their undoing. A message was also inscribed on the wall, stating that only a bloody Baskerville could wield Beelzebub. Vicar immediately understood the significance of what had just transpired. He was looking at the legend of the Lord of the Flies, Beelzebub. This is one of the devils known as the 7 Wows from ancient lore. To defeat these monsters, the heads of 7 great families joined forces, each one targeting a specific devil. The demon that the first Baskerville patriarch battled was none other than Beelzebub. And now Vicar found himself standing before this ancient artifact. The remarkable sword altered its form and merged into the protagonist's body. The two of them had now become a single entity. The question of what power this demonic sword held, however, remained a mystery. A sudden ravenous hunger overtook Vicar. The sword was demanding a proper sacrifice. This urge led him back to the corpse of the hound he had slain earlier. He was surprised to find that the weapon possessed 3 slots for abilities. This appeared to be an intrinsic power of the sword. It made sense, as the Lord of the Flies was known for absorbing the abilities of its foes. Vicar acquired 2 new skills by absorbing the power of Cerberus. He gained the Hellhound's bleeding effect and Cerberus's burning flames. With that done, he could finally take a well-deserved rest until the exam concluded. It was time for evaluations once all the young hounds had made their way back home. One of the slain monsters brought back caused a wave of general disbelief. Even the patriarch couldn't conceal his shock. He personally summoned Vicar to learn how he had succeeded in killing such a formidable beast. The explanation he received left both him and the butler utterly stunned. The main question, however, was why Vicar hadn't submitted a report on his exam. His reply was simple. He didn't view the butler as his superior. For Hugo, the patriarch, these words were like a soothing balm to his soul. He granted Vicar permission to make any wish he desired. The boy requested access to the library, which was one of the most extensive in the entire empire. Hugo's response was surprising. He not only consented, but also pointed out where to find the books detailing their clan's unique techniques. Vicar, however, had a different objective in mind. A particular book authored by the very first Baskerville patriarch. Hugo hadn't yet grasped the book's true significance, and that secret was very close to falling into Vicar's hands. I should explain the Baskervilles' art of swordsmanship. Its foundation is a special technique of drawing teeth, with each motion representing a distinct skill. These skills range in complexity from the most basic to the most advanced levels. Every technique is distinct and has applications for various scenarios. The sixth technique from the book he could access held no interest for Vicar, however. His real target was a tome titled Ambush, concealed somewhere on the shelves of the vast library. This particular book detailed the fundamentals of the first technique, but it had been long forgotten due to missing pages. Vicar was aware that it was far more than a simple textbook. In his former life, he and his squad had discovered a torn page from this very book. It was then that Hugo realized its importance and located the book itself, The Ambush. It concealed the Baskerville family's greatest secret, a top-tier 10th technique, which was the discovery that drove the patriarch to obsession. It was because of this book that he dispatched his hounds to search for the missing pages among all 7 great families. Hugo had managed to reach the 9th technique in his past life, thanks to the efforts of his subordinates. But things are different this time. Vicar had personally gathered these pages, so he had committed every word to memory. He spent only half a day reading the book, yet he remembered and fully grasped its entire contents. Reaching the 10th technique, however, is still a distant goal. Vicar had achieved a new milestone. He had finally drawn the 5th tooth. The joy he felt was overwhelming, nearly moving him to tears. He was deeply pleased, having now reached a level that took him until the age of 30 to achieve in his previous life. An 8-year-old boy had now equaled the skill of the Baskerville masters, but he had no intention of stopping there. In this lifetime, he is determined to master the 10th technique. It wouldn't be wise, however, to reveal his true power to Hugo just yet. All that's necessary is to pique the patriarch's curiosity. That very evening, Vicar approached his father and described his impressions of the 6th technique. He subtly implied that he might have felt the presence of mana. This suggested that he was capable of mastering at least the family's first technique. To verify this, Vicar had to face off against a ravenous, merciless monster. The ensuing spectacle left everyone in awe, but he was only happy for the chance. Vicar effortlessly began to slice the orc to pieces. The orc, which was known for its regenerative abilities, couldn't even begin to heal. The hellhound's bleeding skill was the reason, as it gave the orc no opportunity to recover. Vicar, however, decided to impress his father even further. An aura flared around his blade as he delivered the final blow to the monster. The expression on the patriarch's face at that moment made it all worthwhile. Yet Vicar didn't stop there. He requested another, even more powerful monster. The other young men muttered amongst themselves, thinking Vicar had lost his mind. But he understood the importance of demonstrating his strength at the opportune moment. If he's fortunate and his advancement is acknowledged, he might gain some independence from the patriarch. Hugo chose to grant his son this opportunity. They happened to have a special monster reserved for experimental purposes. It was a genuine troll from the Red and Black Mountains, a creature with a dangerous B-rank classification. Vicar charged into the attack immediately, but soon realized that simple strikes wouldn't suffice against this monster's regeneration. A well-defined strategy was essential. He managed to inflict a deep wound by employing the first technique. Hugo gave the order to halt, but Vicar shouted that he was on the cusp of a breakthrough. Everything was proceeding according to his design. He was deciding just how much power he would reveal. Never before in the history of the Baskerville clan had someone attained the 2nd technique at such a young age. The patriarch was utterly astounded. The pace of change in Vicar's life began to accelerate even more. Even the triplets started trying to get closer to him. A serious discussion with Hugo, however, loomed on the horizon. Shortly before their meeting, important visitors had arrived at Baskerville Manor. Members of the Morgue clan. Adolf, a representative of the Wizard clan, had come to see Hugo, the master of the sword. The dynamic between their two families had always been strained. The Emperor himself once remarked that magic and the sword are merely 2 faces of the same coin. This led to the establishment of joint training exercises to foster stronger ties among the Empire's families. On this occasion, however, a significant issue had come up concerning the ruby mines located on the border between the two clans. The conversation between the two leaders surprisingly started with a discussion about their children. Adolf had heard tales of the young genius from the Baskerville family. The Morgue clan, however, also had a prodigy to boast about. His niece Camus then entered the room. The girl's greeting was immediately confrontational as she accused Hugo of seizing their mine. She continued her tirade, leveling one accusation after another without pause. The patriarch was visibly struggling to maintain his composure. At that moment, Vickers' voice cut through the tension. He immediately pointed out the envy evident in the Morgue family. Camus naturally could not let this remark pass. A flood of memories washed over the boy. He recalled her from his past life. In that timeline, Camus, the genius of the Morgue clan, had single-handedly wiped out all the monsters in the Red and Black Mountains. Her stunning beauty had also captivated everyone who saw her. That, however, was something that would only happen far in the future. For now, he was only facing a stubborn little girl. The young man provoked her further with his suggestions regarding the ruby mines. In an attempt to illustrate her point, Camus conjured an ice sculpture that depicted the territories of the two clans. The other children were completely engrossed by this animated debate. In the midst of it all, a dagger somehow found its way into Vickers' hands. The young man was just about to graze Camus' hand with the dagger's tip, when Adolf materialized in front of him in a flash. It turned out, however, that the weapon was merely a soft toy, a harmless prank. This event sparked an idea in Hugo's mind about how to resolve the ruby mine problem. In the meantime, the joint training sessions got underway. Children between the ages of 8 and 15 were participating. All attention, however, was riveted on a single match, a duel between the prodigies of the two families. Camus had no intention of holding back and immediately started to channel a formidable spell. Vicker, however, was not about to be bested by some girl. He effortlessly shattered the wall that Camus had conjured. He then gave her a gentle poke on the forehead with his finger. The brilliant sorceress stumbled and fell, but the fight was not yet over. Vicker scaled the stone wall once more and delivered a second tap. It seemed he had the upper hand again. The hero then decided to alter the dynamics of the fight a little. Vicker dove straight into the crossfire of another dueling pair. Without a moment's hesitation, Camus charged in after him. The entire arena was quickly shrouded in a thick cloud of smoke. Camus managed to escape harm due to her protective enchantments, but the fire had ruthlessly shredded her clothing. She would become a public spectacle once the smoke dissipated. Overcome with shame, her only recourse was to pray for a miracle. All of a sudden, a jacket was draped over her shoulders. Vicker had unhesitatingly covered her. Camus was frozen in astonishment. Why would this fool decide to help her? As the smoke gradually thinned, both family heads finally relaxed. The spectators were unable to look away from Vicker, amazed by his physique and endurance. Even Camus found herself unable to avert her gaze from her unexpected rescuer. The patriarch was satisfied with his son. The young hero understood the true purpose of these mock battles with wizards. Moreover, Hugo was clearly concerned for Vicker, even if he didn't let it show. A farewell meeting with the Morgue clan was scheduled next. Adolf put forth an unexpected proposition. He offered the Baskerville family a business deal. The payment for the ruby mines would be in the form of a betrothal. He desired for his niece to marry the eldest son of the swordsman family. A slight complication arose at this point. Hugo's eldest heir was already 25, creating a significant age gap with Camus. Camus declared firmly that she would never marry anyone who was weaker than her mother. This was her non-negotiable condition. She also expressed her wish to be with someone closer to her own age. At that moment, her eyes were fixed squarely on Vicker. The Baskerville patriarch noted that the couple's intentions were the most important part of an engagement, and then asked his son for his thoughts. In a move that shocked everyone, Vicker consented to the proposal. While it appears our hero's journey is only just getting started, Camus was left dumbfounded by Vicker's words. Adolf, with a curious expression, assessed the potential groom for his niece. His calm demeanor was deceptive. He was not merely a wizard. He's a master of the Sixth Circle, ranking among the most powerful members of his clan. Adolf, however, decided he needed to speak with Vicker privately. He wanted to personally determine if the boy was a worthy future husband for Camus. The terms of the test were straightforward. A pot of water was balanced on the wizard's head. If Vicker could cause even a single drop to spill, he would be declared the victor. The protagonist understood that his true objective wasn't to prove himself to Adolf. It was to meet Hugo's expectations. Vicker launched his attack in an instant. Adolf, however, proved to be anything but a simple adversary. A potent magical barrier enveloped him. Yet none of these defensive measures intimidated Vicker. He had a clear objective and no intention of backing down. The protagonist brought his sword down on the shield with all his might. His weapon couldn't take the strain and broke into fragments. Adolf simply shook his head, remarking that while the boy was gifted, he was too weak to protect Camus. Those words, however, were no longer relevant. Water was now streaming down the wizard's face. Vicar declared smugly that the objective had been met. Camus made no effort to hide her feelings. Her expression said more than words ever could. Could the patriarch of Baskerville truly be raising a hound that is stronger than anyone ever conceived? I trust you remember our hero well. A full 7 years had gone by. The boys had grown into young men, their bodies having developed incredible strength. Hugo's triplets, in particular, stood out among them, their auras glowing with a deep crimson hue, a color that was perfectly suited to the Baskerville family. Yet even compared to them, Vicar appeared to be a true monster. He had already finished his education at the Baskerville estate, and a decision regarding his future had been made. Vicar hadn't laid eyes on the patriarch in a long time. He had aged considerably, and his face was now covered with new scars. Hugo had personally confronted the legendary archer from a barbarian tribe, the very one who had scarred his face but whom he had never managed to capture. Vicar's only concern, however, was his own destiny. He was once dispatched to the Order of the Pitbulls, where he spent 21 months in the Red and Black Mountains, fighting for survival. At the age of 15, the Baskerville children are sorted into two groups, the elite and the expendable. A son from a lesser branch of the family would never have been selected for the elite. Hugo would never have permitted it. But then a miracle occurred. The patriarch chose to assign Vicar to the lower house of Parliament. His accomplishments had eclipsed all others, and he was now set to become the deputy consul in the city of Underdog. Vicar accepted the post but brought up an important matter. He was now claiming his reward for besting Adolphe Morgue 7 years prior. There was a single highly valuable item that he required. What could it be? We're about to find out. Hugo was quite pleased with his son. He had faith in his potential and was mapping out a grand future for him. The butler, however, shared another crucial piece of information with Vicar. Hugo genuinely did hold his son in high regard, but all of this is merely a prelude to his true goal. The young man will finally have his chance at revenge. Underdog is a large, vibrant city that falls under the rule of the Baskerville clan. Upon his arrival, Vicar decided to mark the occasion with a massive celebration. The party was in full swing, and its extravagance was simply staggering. The city's general secretary, a man named Chihuahua Baskerville, was far from pleased, however. He assumed they had just sent him another incompetent official. Moreover, every one of his predecessors had been caught taking bribes and had fled in disgrace, so his disposition was understandably sour. Chihuahua was on the verge of boiling over with rage when Vicar suddenly materialized right behind him. He calmly introduced himself and, with a slight smile, pointed out that Chihuahua lacked a middle name. Within the Baskerville family, this omission signified only one thing. He wasn't from the main family line. Chihuahua had been treated as an outcast his entire life because of this. This fact, however, only seemed to entertain Vicar. He was already aware that Chihuahua was a native of the city and knew it intimately. Besides, the hero had no plans to interfere with his work. Vicar had already pinpointed the source of Underdog's issues: illicit businesses. He concluded that if he could eliminate all the bosses of the criminal underworld, the city would be revitalized. While Vicar respected the existing laws of Underdog, he decided to introduce a new one. Chihuahua was floored. He certainly hadn't anticipated such a move from the young consul. This was the beginning of their peculiar yet effective collaboration. The following day, Vicar assembled all the city's residents. His objective was straightforward: to dismantle the underground economy as swiftly as possible. The people eyed him with suspicion. What could this young consul possibly accomplish? It was then that Vicar did something entirely unforeseen. He planted a stick in the ground and made a declaration. The person who can pull this out will be awarded 1 million gold pieces. A stunned silence fell over the townspeople. Not a single person even dared to make an attempt. Vicar then increased the reward to 100 million gold. The crowd began to jeer, shouting that it must be some kind of cruel joke. Even this didn't break the stalemate. No one stepped forward. He then raised the prize to 1 billion gold pieces, an amount only the highest echelons of the Baskerville family could possess. The crowd was utterly frozen, and even Chihuahua appeared worried. Then suddenly a small girl stepped out from the crowd. She was trembling, terrified that she might be killed for such boldness. Vicar, however, calmly invited her to give it a try. To the absolute astonishment of everyone present, she pulled the stick right out of the ground. Smiling, Vicar knelt down and presented her with a bag that contained 100 million gold. He assured her that the remainder would be delivered to her home under guard. He declared with conviction the laws must be followed. The city erupted with a mixture of shock and elation. The people now understood that following the law was advantageous, while breaking it was perilous. The rate of lawlessness in Underdog dropped dramatically. Chihuahua, who had long ago given up hope for the city, was completely taken aback. In 20 years, nothing had stirred his soul so profoundly. The young consul had contemplated this plan for a long time before arriving at a simple solution. Deeply affected, Chihuahua pledged his loyalty to the young Baskerville. This, however, was only the first step. The next challenge was to somehow recover the vast sum of money for the city's treasury. Vickers' plan was to target illegal organizations and squeeze them for their ill-gotten gains. His intuition when it came to criminals was flawless, and an intriguing opportunity was on the horizon. A youthful, self-governing group, composed of descendants from 7 local Baskerville families, had abruptly summoned Vicker to a meeting. For our hero, however, this presented the ideal chance to eradicate the parasites that were draining the city's vitality. The Burning Suspension Club was situated in the most opulent hotel in Underdog. In the most secluded corner of the hotel was a room where 6 hours of leisure cost a small fortune. 7 members of the Youth Association, all local bigwigs, were currently relaxing there. They operated with a sense of invincibility, protected by their influential family names. They viewed the Baskerville Hounds as nothing more than brutish fools who could only see the sword in front of them. After a particular incident in Dunaro, they were convinced the clan hadn't understood a thing and had simply accepted the situation. Dunaro, a family that had been among the most loyal to the Baskervilles, was wiped out to the last member on the patriarch's orders. We will circle back to that story at a later time. The wealthy youths, in the meantime, decided to stage an event to draw the new consul, Vicker, to their club. Their plan was to embarrass him and force him to cover the bill for their entire extravagant party. They believed he would be intimidated and stop interfering in their business. They had, however, seriously misjudged him. Vicker made his entrance into the exclusive hall with a group of girls, leaving everyone stunned. He introduced himself nonchalantly, and the crowd recognized him at once. But Vicker's intentions were entirely different. He had no plans to join in the merriment. The protagonist strode over to the champagne tower, and without so much as a blink, sent it crashing to the floor. A hush fell over the hall. Vicker glared at the elite fools and informed them that they would indeed be paying for everything, and not just with gold. Their vapid conversation held no interest for him. He issued a reminder. The hounds of Baskerville never questioned their master, but your minds have long been fogged by money and power. This is the reason he came. The young consul intends to teach these parasites a lesson they won't soon forget. The confrontation naturally concluded in Vicker's favor. The rich parasites were hauled off to prison, all the while shouting about their connections, wealth, and influence. Even Chihuahua was shocked by the extent of their injuries. He was not yet aware that this was merely the beginning. These golden youths were more than just a clique of privileged kids. They were a clandestine organization that was openly challenging the authority of the Baskervilles. Vicker could see it clearly in their insolent, self-assured expressions. But an execution was scheduled for as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. The moment they grasped that this was no joke, all their bravado evaporated. They started pleading for their lives, offering to surrender everything they possessed. It is, however, forbidden to carry out an execution without evidence. And Vicker had his own ways of ensuring that such evidence would surface. A prison guard arrived at the cell carrying a specific item. Following Vicker's orders, he had brought interrogation tools. The hero was preparing to transform these rats into fountains of truth, regardless of how much they begged. News about the 7 wealthy men spread through the city like a contagion. People speculated that it was just a typical power struggle between the old and new elite. The criminals' families even dispatched a formal apology to the consul. The city's inhabitants were certain that the rich boys would soon be set free, and Vicker would be reduced to a mere figurehead. No one, however, could have predicted the actual outcome. 7 severed heads were put on display in the main city square. The city was frozen in shock, while Vicker felt a sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served. This, however, represented only the initial step. The subsequent stage involves the annihilation of criminal organizations. And to reach the top bosses, the city is about to endure a bloodbath. Chihuahua pledged his assistance. Vicker's new plan, something even more audacious, needed to be executed. The plan was to sell the protagonist himself as a slave. On the edge of Underdog, near a massive circus tent, a line of opulent carriages had already formed. A clandestine slave auction was scheduled to take place here this evening. And it goes without saying that no one in the Baskerville family had any inkling of this. The merchandise included abducted barbarians, nobles, and ordinary citizens. This was Vicker's destination, with Chihuahua perfectly playing his part, disguised as a merchant. His special item for sale was quite a sight, with long black hair and fiery red eyes, a truly exotic and rare find. The auction commenced and its sheer scale was remarkable. The auctioneer ceremoniously started the bidding by revealing the first item, an A-rank monster. This particular creature possessed 19 hearts and was valued at 250 million gold. Following that, they presented a barbarian from the Balak tribe, a wild, rebellious slave, perfect for taming. The audience, however, showed their displeasure. They were clearly unimpressed with the offering. The barbarian girl fought back and screamed, but she was swiftly subdued and hauled away. An auction of this caliber demanded only the most worthy items. The subsequent item for sale was Vicar. The auctioneer enthusiastically billed him as the main attraction of the evening. And he wasn't wrong. The bids climbed rapidly, eventually hitting 6 billion gold. The winning bidder was revealed to be a powerful baron. He was the underworld's new kingpin, a man whose fortune had recently exploded. This acquisition, however, was not meant for the baron's long-term collection. His strategy involved reselling the boy at the capital's auction block, anticipating an even greater financial return. As Vicar was presented before his new owner, a grin spread across the baron's face as he promised that a great deal of amusement was in store. The young hero, however, had already begun to execute his own strategy. He shattered his restraints in a single, fluid motion. A solitary, devastating blow reduced the baron to a lifeless and bloody heap on the floor. Tearing off his disguise, Vicar raised his chin and offered a defiant greeting to the assembled guests of the auction. He made it abundantly clear that not a single one of them would be leaving this place alive. Surprisingly, Vicar's declaration did not seem to frighten anyone. The auctioneer quickly regained his composure and commanded the security forces to move in. Their perception was of an unarmed young politician, one who was, moreover, cast in the role of a slave. In reality, none of that mattered. Beelzebub materialized in Vikir's grasp as if answering an unspoken call, and the conflict erupted with fresh intensity. His strikes landed with such speed and force that his adversaries had no time to even comprehend their situation. A brilliant crimson aura flared to life around the hero, as though death itself had made an appearance in the arena. It became obvious to all that they were confronting not just a simple fighter, but a true master of the sword. While Vicar was busy eliminating his foes, Chihuahua's cover was blown. The auctioneer seized him, holding a dagger menacingly against his throat. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire plan had unraveled. Chihuahua yelled for Vicar to press on, but the young man simply smiled. He had no intention of abandoning his companion, as every contingency had already been accounted for. The young consul produced a whistle and blew a sharp, piercing note. An ear-splitting shriek tore through the air, forcing everyone to clap their hands over their ears. Yet, nothing else seemed to happen. The auctioneer let out a triumphant laugh, believing he now had complete command of the circumstances. Suddenly, a sword blade erupted from his throat. A full legion of grim, battle-tested warriors stormed into the chamber. Their very presence erased any doubt. These were the pit bulls of the Baskerville family. They were the Empire's most feared nocturnal order, infamous for their brutal purges and merciless efficiency. The expression on Vicar's face confirmed that events were unfolding precisely as he had designed. The assistant to the Baron who had purchased Vicar understood the situation instantly. Her face went pale with the knowledge that if the pit bulls had arrived, no one was getting out of this place alive. Vicar, however, abruptly ordered that she be kept alive. As for everyone else, he commanded them to be torn to shreds. The events that followed are best left to the imagination. The auction hall transformed into a true charnel house, filled with screams, blood, and the finality of death. The commander of the Pit Bull Order, who was also his uncle, approached Vicar. He clapped his nephew on the shoulder, affirming that if he ever needed assistance, a simple whistle would suffice. He went so far as to invite the boy to become a member of the order. Vicar, however, had more pressing matters to attend to. He proceeded to the warehouse where all the slaves and monsters were being held captive. It was there that he located her, the same barbarian woman who had resisted so fiercely at the start of the auction. The poor woman was clinging to life by a thread. It was evident she had endured torture and mistreatment, which had sapped nearly all of her previous vitality. She was, however, more fortunate than the others, for Vicar had found her. He administered a healing potion to her without a second thought, and a near-miraculous recovery took place. The woman abruptly regained consciousness. The protagonist had a rudimentary grasp of the barbarian tongue, so he quickly urged her to flee. The girl yelled something unintelligible but complied, disappearing into the shadows. Vicar's thoughts had already moved on. It was time to claim the evening's grand prize. His objective was unambiguous, the carcass of the monster with 19 hearts. Beelzebub seemed to hum in the hero's hand, as if it could sense the impending meal. It appeared the sword was famished and craved a substantial sacrifice. It didn't take long for the stories to circulate. The city was alive with gossip. All that was left of the exclusive club that had served as a haven for underdogs' parasites were charred ruins. The proprietors of the establishment were found dead and put on public exhibition. This served as a grim notice to any who might think they could evade the new regime. The situation became so intense that the heads of the 7 most powerful clans came to literally plead for forgiveness. Vicar, however, had no intention of offering them clemency. He possessed proof of their descendants' crimes, and by the laws of the Baskerville family, this had only one meaning. 3 generations of these traitors would not live to see another sunrise. In spite of all this bloody upheaval, the city actually started to thrive. The crime rate plummeted, and the young consul's renown only continued to expand. Chihuahua had undergone a transformation as well, now serving as a devoted ally to Vicar. The Secretary General held the unwavering conviction that Underdog could only prosper under such a leader. But Vicar's work was not yet complete. He had another crucial meeting scheduled with a woman known as Cindy. It was the blonde whose life he had intentionally spared. Naturally, he had kept her alive for a specific reason. The young consul was aware that Baron Gambino's rapid ascent was largely due to this young woman's influence. His investigation had validated his theories. Cindy possessed a rare talent for generating wealth even in the most dire of circumstances. Vicar presented her with an ultimatum: provide answers to all his questions and earn her freedom. The alternative, well, there were not many other possibilities, a fact the girl understood perfectly. He had one primary interest: her assessment of him as a political figure. Cindy gave an honest reply, stating that he was managing quite effectively. Vicar, however, was seeking the unvarnished truth that lay beneath her polite response. Fear gripped Cindy the moment their gazes locked. Vicar's stare was cold as he demanded to know precisely what he was doing incorrectly. The girl knew that stalling was futile. She had to be direct. She elaborated that while good works were admirable, laws targeting crime were insufficient on their own. In time, these same laws would begin to negatively impact ordinary citizens, and the resulting public anger would be directed at the consul. Furthermore, the Baskervilles would not tolerate him becoming more powerful than their own representative and underdog. The solution? Cindy proposed a straightforward yet perilous strategy: cede all power and credit back to the clan's leader and then vanish from the public eye. She suggested enrolling in the Imperial Academy, a distant and inconspicuous destination. Then when the moment was right, the Baskerville chief would serve as a convenient fall guy. The suggestion was akin to a dog turning on its own master. The girl was adamant that this was the only way for the hound to escape the patriarch's ire. Vicar gave her his full attention as she spoke. He found her reasoning sound as it aligned with his own conclusions. He was a man who always honored his commitments, so Cindy was now free to go. He had one final question for her before she left. What information did she have on the Dunaro clan? This merchant family was once well known, before a tragic event erased them from existence. The youngest son of the Dunaro family had decided to flaunt his sword skills. The Baskervilles were shocked to see the boy demonstrating their clan's secret techniques. News of this reached the patriarch, who then unleashed his hunting dogs. The Dunaro clan was permanently eradicated, but they were not the true culprits. 7 young parasites from prominent clans had stolen the technique and coached the hapless boy in order to frame his family. Cindy could not fathom why Vicar was recounting this old tale. The explanation was simple. On the night of that bloody purge, one small girl managed to survive. Her beauty spared her life, but this led to an even more terrible fate as she endured unspeakable torture. The new consul had brought this story into the light and ensured the 7 parasites received their due punishment. They had confessed to all their crimes just before they were executed. With tears streaming down her face, Cindy cried out, "Who were they asking for forgiveness from?" Vicar quietly replied, "The same girl who now lives under the false name of Cindy, the sole survivor of the Dunaro clan." She was in disbelief. Yet when she saw the bodies and the bloody confessions scrawled on the cell walls, the truth became undeniable. This, however, was not sufficient. Vicar issued one final command to her: to despise the Baskervilles with every fiber of her being. Cindy vowed that from that day forward, she would dedicate herself to ensuring that Vicar Van Baskerville would never lack for money or intelligence. It seems our young protagonist has secured another steadfast ally. The whirlwind of events surrounding Vicar never ceased for a moment. The Baskerville family's butler made an unforeseen visit to Underdog. His arrival was not without purpose. The patriarch lauded Vicar's accomplishments and summoned him back to the main estate. Upon his return, Vicar went to see his father without delay. His actions had helped shed the Baskerville family's reputation as heartless warriors who could only see the sword before them. The most peculiar thing was the look of happiness on his father's face. Yet the surprises were far from over. Vicar was instructed to enroll in the Imperial Academy Coliseum, a gathering place for all the Empire's elite. This presented an opportunity to increase his strength without drawing undue attention. His father also granted him the authority to decide who would accompany him. He chose the triplets without a second thought, seeing them as perfect live targets for his training. Meanwhile, Hugo recalled Vickers' strategy for the ruby mines, a plan he had devised at the age of 8. As it turned out, the plan had been a success. The Morgue family had proposed a joint expedition, and Vicar was tasked with surveying the area before he left for the academy. Officially, the protagonist departed from Underdog, entrusting all city matters to Chihuahua. He set out for the borderlands accompanied by the Order of Pitbulls, heading toward the ruby mines that the Baskervilles had ceded to the Morgue family. On paper, the mission was an inspection. The true objective was to use it as a pretext to eliminate the local barbarians. Squads of Baskerville forces were positioned on the far side of the mountains, ready to move in if necessary. Hugo quipped that it was also an excellent chance to observe how the barbarians lived. Vickers' reception, however, was less than welcoming. 3 young women blocked his path at the fortress entrance. It was the triplets again, and they looked familiar to him. He recalled that in his past life, they were known as the 3 flowers of the Morgue family, each one uniquely unhinged. When they were together, they became a force of nature. Vicar had no intention of waiting and demanded immediate passage. The triplets' response was just as he expected. They chose to attack the unwelcome visitors. The most fascinating development, however, happened next. The Baskerville triplets joined the fray. Hugo's triplets genuinely wished to express their gratitude to their brother for the opportunity to attend the academy. In the years to come, these boys are destined to become lethal soldiers who will faithfully execute Vickers' commands. If he trains them properly, they will evolve into flawless combatants. The girls from the fortress were already at the height of their fury and were poised to charge into the fight. Vicar remembered that the Morgue triplets were once renowned as magicians, with each sister commanding a different elemental power. Their combined attacks were exponentially more powerful. The young Baskervilles were now about to face this destructive force. The boys charged ahead, pitting their family's sword techniques against the formidable spells of the Morgue triplets. The Pitbull squad simply observed the skirmish with amusement. After all, a fight of this nature was quite a spectacle. The age-old debate over whether the sword or magic is superior had once again come to the forefront. As he watched the battle unfold, the commander noted the importance of evaluating the young talents of the clan. Their potential would shape the Empire's future, a rather compelling task. The protagonist remarked that he, too, was a member of this chosen generation. The commander, however, maintained that the young master had long since surpassed this level of skill. From Vickers' perspective, this entire conflict was a misuse of his time. His priority was to reach the fortress as quickly as possible. But then just as suddenly the fight was over. A fiery blast sent all the triplets sprawling. Standing on the fortress walls was a sorceress of breathtaking beauty, who seemed oblivious to the chaos below. Camus. She recognized Vicar instantly and made her way toward him. 7 years had passed since their last encounter, and she had grown even more beautiful. Vicar, however, paid this no mind, stating only that he needed to get inside. Camus was taken aback. Was that truly all he had to say to her after so many years? Vicar was confused by her strong reaction. He didn't feel that he owed her any particular greeting. With tears welling in her eyes, Camus declared that such a cold attitude was inappropriate for her future husband. Everyone was frozen in place, absolutely everyone. And Vicar himself was the most shocked of all. Following an intense emotional discussion, Vicar and Camus decided to take a walk. Camus questioned why he had brought 3 young fools with him, whom she called future hounds. Vicar countered that the main contingent of his forces was waiting beyond the mountain range, a fact she was well aware of. The girl persisted with her odd line of questioning. Now she was suddenly curious about which barbarian tribes were the most hostile. Vicar gave a prompt reply: the Balax and the Rococo. Camus simply laughed and awarded him an 8 out of 100 for his intelligence. She then commented that she didn't care for smart men at all, finding a man much more appealing when he's a bit foolish. She continued her assessment, giving him a score of 99 for his flawless face. Vicar just rolled his eyes and asked her to end this pointless charade. But Camus was unyielding, stating that as his future wife, it was her duty to be demanding. It was at this point that Vicar realized his grave error. He had completely forgotten about their engagement. The entire situation stemmed from that incident 7 years ago when they were just children. He requested that Camus simply let it go and act as if nothing had happened. The girl became furious, retorted that one can't just turn back time, and threw a piece of cloth at him. Vicar recognized it immediately. It was his jacket. Camus turned bright red, but was unable to say anything more as their walk was cut short. A search party had just captured a barbarian scout. The young man recognized him at once as a member of the Rococo tribe of magicians. The barbarian remained silent, and no magical interrogation could loosen his tongue. This was a situation Camus could not tolerate. Just a few days earlier, barbarians had raided the fortress and abducted Rose, a daughter of the Morgue family. No one among them could understand the barbarians' language. Vicar, however, addressed the creature directly, and it replied with aggression, yet also with a hint of sinister satisfaction. Vicar calmly relayed the message. Rose is dead. An uncontrollable rage consumed Camus. She delivered the sentence without a moment's hesitation, and the barbarian died instantly. It was then that the girl's composure finally shattered. Despite her power, she was still just a child who lacked the experience to cope with such intense grief. And then she finally processed the barbarian's words. She whispered to Vicar, asking if she had understood correctly that these monsters had consumed poor Rose. This realization only worsened Camus' state. Vicar made no attempt to comfort her. He felt he had no right to do so. Camus' power was truly formidable. She declared with firm resolve that she would have her revenge on the barbarians, and Vicar had no doubt she would. This was the response of a true hero. Once again, however, their moment of connection was rudely interrupted. A loud bell sounded from the fortress, signaling that the enemy was attacking. Barbarians were already swarming the walls, their arrows darkening the sky. The mountain folk were not only fierce warriors but also expert archers. Vicar had a feeling that he might have arrived on the scene a bit prematurely. He had no time to ponder this as two barbarians suddenly ensnared him with ropes around his neck. They spoke in an unfamiliar tongue, but their intent was perfectly clear without translation. They had successfully hunted a man. Vicar, however, had no intention of becoming their quarry. He freed himself from the two women with a simple, effortless movement. The protagonist recalled Hugo's command not to join the fight until the main forces had arrived. But was there any point in waiting at all? Lost in thought, Vicar mechanically parried arrows until he heard Camus' voice from behind him. She couldn't understand his hesitation to kill them. The daughter of the Morgue family desired the death of every last one of these barbaric savages. At the same time, she was impressed by the level of mastery the Baskerville heir had attained. But if Vicar was bound by the patriarch's orders, then she would have to take matters into her own hands. Her desire for vengeance for her cousin was simply too powerful to ignore. Suddenly, a slender needle struck her in the neck. The barbarians were employing a paralytic poison. The situation was quickly becoming perilous. The young man knew he had to act with caution and perhaps even consider a tactical withdrawal. Camus yelled that she couldn't stop, that her quest for revenge was paramount. Vicar urged her to think logically, but just then, something streaked past his head with immense force. It was an arrow, and its destructive power was so great that it momentarily stunned him. In that brief second, Camus vanished. The barbarians had taken her. Vicar's gaze snapped in her direction, and he realized who he was facing. It was the girl with the bow. She was the same one he had set free at the slave auction. Vicar was utterly dumbfounded. Was betrayal truly the reward for his act of salvation? She stated curtly that the Morgue family was of no concern to him. If he wished to retrieve the beautiful girl, he would need to come after them. Vicar was contemplating whether to unleash his full power when a massive wave of magical energy erupted behind him. It was Adolphe Morgue, and the magician was incandescent with fury. His magic ripped the earth asunder, attempting to block the barbarians' escape. They managed to slip away nonetheless, making for the forbidden lands near the Red and Black Mountains. Adolphe, consumed by despair, knew he was powerless to rescue his niece. But then Vicar himself called out. This was hardly his first foray into danger. The Morgue leader didn't even consider trying to hold him back. On the contrary, this brilliant and fearless Baskerville was now his only hope. The thick forest of the Red and Black Mountains was situated within Baskerville lands. This area was infested with monsters and other terrifying creatures. A normal person would not survive for even an hour there. It wasn't called the forest that consumes life for nothing. This, however, didn't bother Vicar. He felt completely at ease here. Adolphe and a contingent of pit bulls trailed behind him. The Baskerville triplets, mesmerized by his prowess, couldn't tear their eyes away. They soon neared the barbarian encampment. To avoid detection, Adolphe Morgue wove a spell of silence around them. He vowed he would never forget his nephew's assistance in this matter. Meanwhile, a furious Camus was shouting that she would kill every single barbarian. Her threats, however, fell on deaf ears. One of the barbarians had clearly taken an interest in her. He couldn't understand her words, but he could tell she had no intention of complying. However, Ayun, the same girl Vicar had once rescued, gave a command that her prize was not to be touched. The barbarians started to quarrel, but Ayun swiftly asserted her authority. The man relented, which was unusual, as he wasn't known for giving up his trophies. Ayun had just begun to speak with Camus when a loud explosion rocked the area from behind. The camp was under attack. Camus knew at once her uncle had arrived. Meanwhile, the wizards and swordsmen were mercilessly dispatching the barbarians. Everything seemed to be proceeding without a hitch, but Vicar couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Why did the Balak warriors, who were known for their methodical ambushes, now seem so agitated? The barbarians muttered to one another that these attackers were absolute lunatics. To create such a disturbance in the middle of the night, deep in the forest, was pure insanity. Adolf, however, was resolute. He ordered that no barbarian be left alive and that the pursuit continue to the very end. In the midst of the chaos, Vicar freed Camus, and at that very moment Ayun appeared before them. She had been expecting him. She knew he would come back. The barbarian woman studied Vicar intently before saying mysteriously that he had passed. Past what? The young man, of course, had no idea what she meant. A dangerous tension sparked between the two young women. It seemed both had their own designs on our hero. Vicar had no memory of a barbarian like Ayun from his previous life. One thing, however, did trouble him. Could she really be the one who had scarred Hugo's face? She seemed too young, though, to be the legendary archer of the Balak tribe, the Night Fox. Suddenly, another poisoned needle whizzed in their direction. Vicar's patience was wearing thin. His first priority was to get Camus back to her uncle. He would deal with everything else after that. Ayun, however, had entirely different intentions. She wanted her savior to accompany her of his own free will. It appeared that escaping from these two would not be a simple matter. Ayun chose to take drastic measures to remove Camus from the picture. The arrow she loosed flew true toward its mark. Adolf, however, conjured an ice wall at the last second, saving his niece. There was no time to celebrate, though. Almost immediately, a rope tightened around Vicar's neck. Ayun shouted that he would be wise not to struggle, as they were nearly out of time. But what was the rush? The sense of foreboding grew thicker, like the surrounding darkness. Ayun was clearly on edge. They had been detected. Beelzebub activated on Vicar's hand. The barbarian cried out that Madame Octopus was drawing near. And almost instantly, a horrifying sound shattered the nocturnal silence. An immense column shot vertically toward the heavens. Vicar found the sight utterly surreal. This was a monster he recognized from past knowledge. Could this be Madame Octopus, a creature designated with an S-level threat classification? The sheer terror inspired by the creature before them stifled any scream, as making a sound would have been a fatal mistake. Any impulse to panic would need to be deferred indefinitely. Madame Octopus possessed weak vision, but her senses of hearing and perception were exponentially more acute than any human's. Even before Vicar's regression, a sage had spoken of calamitous events within the Red and Black Mountains. The legend read more like a chilling tale of an 8-limbed monstrosity dwelling in the forest's deepest reaches. Ancient imperial archives even contain mentions of this being. This single monster held the power to annihilate an entire nation within a day. The circumstances were rapidly worsening as the spider's venom began to permeate the area, compelling Ayun to move faster. They needed to escape without a moment's delay. Fleeing from this creature was not a simple matter, however, as it could perceive virtually everything in its vicinity. The Balak tribe fragmented into smaller units and initiated a retreat. In contrast, the Morgan Baskerville clans fled as a single large group, a decision that would prove disastrous. Madame Octopus had selected her prey. Desperate attempts by the wizards to halt the giant spider proved utterly futile. Its legs impaled its targets as if they were meat on a skewer. Even Adolf Morg, stunned by the spectacle, had no thoughts of fighting. His only instinct was to run. Vicar knew what had to be done. If he didn't intervene, no one would make it out alive. He could not permit this creature to encroach upon Baskerville territory. The monster's legs had to be bound to give the others even a sliver of a chance. And he was the only one with the capability to accomplish such a feat. The choice was made. Adolf granted him leave to engage and commanded the others to fall back. Of course, the potential destruction of Baskerville clan lands would have suited Vicar perfectly. Hugo's sight. It would buy him the time he needed to cultivate the power he held within his memories. Then once he was powerful enough to erase his own trail, he would make his return. For now, though, failing to give his all would mean certain death. Vicar commanded an incredible amount of raw power. Yet his most significant asset was his indomitable spirit. That spirit alone enabled him to stand against the horror that now towered over them. His subsequent strike. It is difficult to articulate its nature. It was a wave of pure, annihilating energy that consumed everything in its path. The entire forest was bathed in a crimson radiance. And Camus, she could barely manage to let a single tear fall. Was this how it all ended? No, the end had not yet come. Vicar awoke in a place he did not recognize at all. He was certain of one thing. He had somehow survived the encounter with Madame. Had the spider not frozen in place at the critical juncture, his life would have surely been forfeit. Even so, the direct confrontation with the monster had left him with severe injuries. If things continued on their current path, however, one could argue that his plan was succeeding. Crucially, he had managed to escape the ever-watchful eye of Hugo. Furthermore, destiny had delivered him to the village of the Balak tribe. One question lingered, though. Why was he still alive? The answer to that question presented itself shortly. The same man who had been firing poison darts earlier approached Vicar. A smug smile on his face, he suggested that the hero should feel fortunate just to be breathing. He explained that if it weren't for his status as the commander's dog, he would have been boiled in a pot long ago. Vicar stared at him, his heart tightening with a surge of anger. The reference to being a dog brought back memories of the patriarch himself. The boy's gaze filled with a dark rage, his body coiling with the urge to kill. Before he could act, however, a sharp blow sent him staggering. The barbarian sneered that he should go find his master, who would be at the other end of the rope tied to him. Vicar clenched his jaw, committing the boy's face to memory. He would have his revenge. He located the rope's owner soon after. A beautiful barbarian archer was sitting in a small lake, calmly submerged in its waters. Her curt command to get down caught him off guard. The reason for her order quickly became apparent as an arrow zipped past his head. The barbarian children were practicing their archery and had nearly killed the main character. Ayan didn't seem surprised in the least. She simply expressed her thanks to Vicar for rescuing her at the slave auction. Barbarian customs dictated that a favor must be repaid twofold, so she had now saved him twice. If she hadn't come back for him after his battle with Madame, the outcome could have been very different. Vicar remained confused. Why had his life been spared at all? Ayan was fully conscious of his elevated social standing. To be frank, she was intrigued by the potential price his return might fetch. She had absolutely no intention of returning him to civilized society, however. From this point on, Vicar was her property, and he was to address her as mistress. Before he could process that, however, there was another matter to attend to: greeting the chieftain of this tribe. The matriarch was already awaiting their arrival. The tent that served as the matriarch's dwelling was impressively large. It was the home of Ayan's mother. The mistress appeared quite pleased that the source of her daughter's recent preoccupation had finally arrived in her village. Vicar assessed the situation immediately. He was standing before the Night Fox, the legendary warrior of the Balak tribe who had once scarred Hugo's nose. She was the very reason why, in his past life, Vicar had been unable to traverse the Red and Black Mountains. If a conflict were to erupt between them now, his chances of victory would be non-existent. The matriarch also detected a sense of familiarity in the boy's features. It was quite simple. The barbarian instinctively recognized the scent of Hugo's bloodline. For the time being, however, she kept her suspicions to herself while Ayan was already making plans for her new slave. After he receives treatment, he will prove to be exceptionally useful. Vicar surveyed the tent's interior while the two women were engrossed in conversation. His challenges, however, were only just beginning. The new owner's first directive was for him to construct a dwelling for her. As a true slave, he was in no position to refuse and had no choice but to comply. Ayan wanted to determine if this handsome imperial was as foolish as he appeared. She also intended to use him as a means to reinforce the local hierarchy. The protagonist, however, completed the task with ease. He didn't merely construct a house, he built it perfectly, with every detail meticulously planned. Furthermore, Vicar even identified a structural issue with the matriarch's own tent. He clearly articulated the problem to Ayan, who then instructed him to resolve it. And so the hero undertook the arduous task of brickmaking. All of his hard work paid off. The matriarch was amazed. It seemed her daughter had selected a commendable partner. Vicar, however, was formulating his own agenda. He yearned to integrate himself into this forest existence. An opportunity to prove he was deserving of his freedom would soon present itself. The village had been struggling with a scarcity of large game recently. If Vicar could successfully hunt something truly massive, he would transition from slave to ordinary citizen. This generous offer did not go unnoticed. Ayan was keeping a close watch on the entire situation. Every culture has its own belief system, and the Balak tribe was no different. Prior to every hunt, the shaman conducted a ritual for the warriors. The barbarians felt a sense of guilt for taking innocent lives, so they would smear their faces with charcoal to conceal themselves from the god of death. Vicar, however, quickly deduced that these rites were merely a means for the shaman to preserve his authority. Even within such a secluded tribe, the power dynamics mirrored those of the empire. Following the ritual, Vicar was fitted with the requisite spiked combat collar. This was a standard piece of protection to prevent a cornered animal from tearing out a hunter's throat. He sensed that he was slowly starting to acclimate to this new way of life, a feeling he found surprisingly agreeable. As is often the case, however, something was destined to go awry. Ayan initiated another confrontation, attempting to boast about being the one to bring down the largest animal. His primary interest, however, was the collar fastened around Vicar's neck. The barbarians seemed to find it unbelievable that the commander would actually take an injured man on a hunt. In his view, Vicar would only be a liability. Before making such pronouncements, however, one should mind their own equipment. Vicar pointedly suggested that one should cling to their weapon as fervently as they would a lifelong partner, lest they easily lose it. Ayan grew enraged, poised to attack him, but she had no authority to give orders to another's property. So Ayan decided she would teach Vikir a lesson herself. He received a rather severe beating, so we will omit the details of his injuries. One thing was certain, Ayan had reasserted her dominance. Afterward, however, she began to fret, wondering if she had gone too far and angered him. But Vicar found the situation so unpleasant that he could barely speak, a fact the girl quickly perceived. Ayan did not waste a moment. The instant she heard him mention his pain, she rushed to his side. Before Vicar could protest, her lips were on his face. A moment of awkward silence followed. Apparently, the barbarians had a custom of licking one another's wounds. Then Ayan unexpectedly vowed to do anything within her power for him. Vicar was taken aback, but he certainly wasn't going to let such an opportunity pass. Ayan noted his prolonged hesitation. In the end, however, Vicar made only one request: to be taught how to use a bow. The lessons commenced almost immediately. The Balak people were true archery virtuosos, and their teaching was as skillful as their shooting. Vicar's lesson, however, was cut short unexpectedly. The wolf that Ayan rode had detected something of importance. This discovery would allow them to travel much more quickly. A mountain river flowed into the ocean, and the area teemed with wildlife. Fish, swept along by the swift current, would often be dashed against the sharp rocks, providing an easy meal for the bull bear. The specimen that Vicar and Ayan were observing was not just large. This was a bull bear of impeccable lineage that had survived numerous trials. They had no intention of hunting this one, however. Their quarry was the male that the female bull bear was awaiting. She needed to select a weaker mate to ensure her complete dominance over him. A strong male, after all, might simply kill her. A similar principle existed among the Balak people. The most sought-after partners were always young men with ideal genetics. All they had to do now was wait for the female to completely assert her dominance over the male. The process took quite some time. 4 days had passed since Vicar and Ayan began tracking the creatures. Throughout this time, the protagonist watched in astonishment as the bull bears engaged in a frenzied mating ritual. Ayan simply smiled, implying that things were much the same within her own tribe. She even insinuated that the people of the empire were not capable of such passion. She wondered aloud if Vicar was capable of it. Their rather intimate exchange was interrupted by the bear herself. The ritual was over, and the female now drove the male away, as he had become nothing more than competition for food and territory. The exhausted male sought a secluded spot to recover. This was the moment for the predators to begin their hunt. They trailed the bull bear all the way to the icy peaks. The biting cold chilled Vicar to the core. Ayan immediately cautioned him that if he were to freeze, he would become a dead weight on the hunt. His only option was to press himself as closely as possible to his companion. The next moment, however, held a surprise for both of them. The monster's tracks abruptly ended. The creature had concealed itself in a cave and was lying in wait for them. Would the bear's ambush prove fatal? If not for Vicar's swift reflexes, Ayan would have surely been torn apart. Vicar was the first to launch an attack. It seemed the bull bear had deliberately lured them into an ambush. It was now clear why the female had been so interested in this particular male. He was far more powerful than he appeared. Our heroes now had to face this monster directly. Ayan was determined to prove that she was the one in command of the situation. She instructed Vicar to simply stay hidden and not to get involved. Hunting was her domain, not a task for a slave. The Balak people's treatment of their servants was certainly unusual. Even more remarkable, however, was their skill with the bow. It made no difference to Ayan if her target was hidden behind rocks. The arrow of a true archer could penetrate even steel. No sooner had the arrowhead vanished from view than it pierced through the ice and struck the monster. Vicar realized that his mistress was not just a talented marksman. She manipulated her mana with as much skill as she did her weapon. In terms of sheer skill, she might even be superior to Kemu Morg. The bull bear, however, was not going to succumb so easily. Infuriated, it continued its assault despite its numerous injuries. Yet an arrow infused with Ayan's resolve could breach castle walls, let alone a monster. At the last second, however, the bear swerved abruptly and lunged straight for the archer. Ayan didn't have time to react as the beast knocked her from her wolf's back. The night fox had always said that animals can sense the murderous intent radiating from a person. And that is precisely what Ayan had forgotten at the most critical moment. Could it all end so anticlimactically? Numberless, Vicar appeared directly in front of the monster's face. One must not forget about the main character. It was now his turn to display his power. The flames of Cerberus erupted from his sword, incinerating the unfortunate bull bear in a single strike. This level of power from Vicar was simply overwhelming. His weakened body, however, was not yet capable of handling such a strain. The Balak tribe had another rather fascinating custom. The hunter who successfully brought down the largest animal earned the respect and admiration of the entire tribe. And so Vicar became the hero of the hunt. There was, however, a less pleasant aspect to this tradition. The one who gained the most prestige was also allotted the smallest portion of the meat. This, however, was of little concern to Vicar. He had acquired something far more precious during this hunt. Beelzebub had absorbed the 600 kilograms of a bull bear's stamina, and his sword drew in the monster's life force, which significantly restored Vicar's own body. And now for something more amusing. Ayan set another serving of meat before him and insisted that he consume the strange item on the plate. The Balak people held the belief that a hunter should eat the part of the monster's body that corresponds to their own weaknesses. The young man couldn't figure out what it was. Could it really be intestines? The reactions of the other warriors, however, suggested otherwise. They yelled at Ayan that her intentions were too transparent. Regardless, Vicar still ate his serving. Ayan was overjoyed. In her view, he could now properly fulfill his duties. But let us return to the daily routines of the barbarians. Following a successful hunt, the tribe would perform a sacrifice, offering a large portion of their catch to Madame Octopus. They were asking for her consent to inhabit this forest. Vicar had been observing the tribe's reverence for Madame for a long time and was increasingly aware of how reckless his previous actions had been. The Balak traditions, however, did not stop there. A long queue had formed at the entrance to the matriarch's tent. It transpired that Night Fox Aquila had convened the elders for a significant meeting. As the tribe celebrated Hunter, Vicar was now in a position to ask the matriarch for whatever he wished. And Ayan already had an excellent suggestion for him. All that was left was for him to make the request. Aquila was greatly satisfied with the young hero's performance. This brilliant archer, as majestic as Hugo yet with a warm and gentle strength, decided to elevate Vicar's social standing. He was now officially a full-fledged member of the Balak family. And as such, he was entitled to make one request. Carrying out Ayan's suggestion, Vicar asked for an ablution in the hero's spring. Vicar's petition was perceived as overly audacious. The shaman was incensed. How dare some former slave, who had only recently joined them, ask for such a privilege? The hero's spring was a sacred site for the Balak people, accessible only to their most revered warriors. This was more than just a hot spring. It had the power to heal both physical and spiritual wounds. Aquila might have considered it, but there was no justification for such a generous gift. The debate was cut short by the ringing of a bell, signaling the arrival of guests in the village. The Night Fox deferred the matter for a later time. The shaman, meanwhile, continued to shoot daggers at Vicar with his eyes. Merchants had arrived. Vicar instantly recognized the bourgeois family. How had they managed to get here? None of the great houses, neither the Baskervilles nor the Morgues, would have granted them passage through their lands. It became clear that they had utilized smugglers' routes. The hero observed without getting involved. While the details of market manipulation are likely of little interest, here is what he witnessed. The merchants were trading common imperial goods, food and basic necessities for rare local resources. They were shamelessly exploiting the fact that the barbarians were unaware of the true market value of their goods. Vicar could have revealed this deception, but doing so would have risked exposing his own identity. His restraint snapped when a little girl from the tribe attempted to trade for a glass sphere that she believed would bring her sweet dreams. She offered a rare and highly nutritious sun beetle in exchange. The merchant merely grimaced in disgust and swatted the creature from her grasp. Then, switching to the imperial tongue, he remarked that the girl was quite attractive and would fetch a good price if sold into slavery. This transaction did not proceed. Vicar stepped in. It wasn't just this one horrific act. He exposed the entire operation. The merchants had been swindling the Balak people by taking advantage of their trusting nature. The protagonist was perfectly aware of the actual cost of the goods. But there was more. The supposed dream sphere was nothing but an ordinary ball filled with holes and laced with narcotics, a substance outlawed throughout the empire. Ayun grasped the situation and a wave of rage washed over her. An arrow propelled by her fury found its mark in the merchant's shoulder. Those scoundrels fled, but no one gave chase. Ayun knew that if you injure one animal in a pack, it will invariably lead you back to the rest. And that is precisely what occurred. The traders made their way back to their smuggler associates. They would not, however, escape justice. A single fate awaited them: complete annihilation. The mercenaries, accompanied by the merchants, began their search for the Balak people, but it was a futile effort. The barbarians had spotted their adversaries long before they were even aware of being watched. The only thing that gave away their position was the faint glow of a cigarette. Ayun commanded her fighters to aim exclusively for the head. Vicar, meanwhile, was setting his own strategic move into motion. Barrels had been suspended above the mercenaries' heads, and not without reason. The moment flaming arrows struck them, the oil within detonated. The Balak warriors fought without mercy, but one merchant remained apart from the battle. It was this man that Vicar hunted down. In a panic, the man began screaming that he couldn't be killed. He brandished a piece of paper bearing the official seal of the Consul of Underdog, a permit for trade. He further asserted that the document had been signed by Vicar himself. The protagonist was flabbergasted, as he had most certainly not granted any such permission. The witness to his true identity did not survive for long. Vicar dispatched him quickly and then fled with Ayun. The mercenaries were baffled as to why the Balak forces were suddenly retreating and decided to give chase, intending to cut them down. This, however, was not to be. She had awakened. Madame Octopus arrived just as Vicar had anticipated. Furthermore, his fiery strategy had worked flawlessly. He was now officially acknowledged as a great warrior of the Balak tribe. Without any hesitation, Aquila granted him permission to bathe in the hero's spring. Shaman Akaman did not even spare him a glance. The merchant's words, however, continued to trouble Vicar. He had claimed their trade was sanctioned by the shaman himself. It was obvious that something was amiss, but he chose to address it later. First, he would rest. The waters of the spring had the ability to purify mana and mend internal injuries. While this place could not be compared to the river Styx, it at least lacked any age restrictions. To add to the situation, Ayun decided to join her former slave for a swim. The girl showed no concern that her presence might diminish the effectiveness of the ablution. She was preoccupied with another matter. She intended to make Vicar her own. The conversation between them flowed easily. This continued until Vicar abruptly asked Ayun how she preferred to be addressed, by her name or simply as slave. Her ambiguity was beginning to annoy him. Ayun drew nearer, clearly about to clarify her intentions. She didn't want to call him slave or even Vicar, but simply, her answer, however, was never voiced. A throng of small barbarian children burst into the spring. The matriarch had ordered that they be allowed to bathe here, as their bodies had been weakened by the imperial drugs. Ayun offered her gratitude to Vicar for assisting her sister, extending an apology for all their past hostilities. It appeared the protagonist had at last earned his place as an integrated member of the tribe. Then, almost imperceptibly, 2 years passed in a flash. Vicar was now 17 years old. Throughout this period, he had polished his abilities to a state of perfection. He could now unleash all 6 of the Baskerville claws with ease, though the 10th technique remained a distant ambition. Achieving the 6th level at the age of 17 was a truly phenomenal accomplishment. His mastery of the 6th magic circle was a testament to his status as a master swordsman. Time, however, was slipping away, and he became aware of how long he had remained in the forest. One constant remained: he and Ayun continued to hunt side by side. Vicar couldn't help but notice that something was troubling her, however. Ayun produced a dagger that had been dropped by one of the Imperials who recently ventured into the forest. The emblem etched onto the weapon was one he recognized: the sigil of the Leviathan clan. This family held a level of influence within the empire comparable to that of the Baskervilles. An intruder who had trespassed in the forest was seen pouring a red substance into several water sources before vanishing. One of these infiltrators was captured, but he chose to die by swallowing poison, leaving only the dagger behind. Yet something else weighed on Ayan's mind. She was a person who could not abide dishonesty and secrecy. Consequently, she admitted that another person from the Empire had also entered the forest. And Vicar was undoubtedly the object of this person's search because it was that same girl. For 2 full years, this girl had repeatedly led search parties into the woods. Her efforts were clearly aimed at finding any trace of Vikir. Ayan expressed her anxiety, wondering if he would leave with the girl should they ever meet. She was terrified of being hated for withholding such critical information. Vikir, however, gave her an immediate and decisive answer. He would not be returning. This was the honest truth. Ayan was unable to conceal her delight. Vikir knew that as far as the Empire was concerned, he was dead. He only intended to go back once he had learned to flawlessly conceal his true power. But this girl, could she truly be Camus Morgue? Was it possible she hadn't forgotten his act of rescue? Or was this merely a move in a larger diplomatic strategy? The young man concluded that he needed to gather information about what was transpiring outside the forest. Abruptly, a colossal aquatic monster leaped from the water. This particular fish served as a herald of the rainy season, and its immense size suggested this season would be a long one. Something seemed off, however. An arrow was protruding from its underside. Upon cutting the fish open, they discovered a human skeleton within. Ayan knew at once that it belonged to a member of the Rococo tribe. This discovery was perplexing, as the monster was a simple-minded creature that exclusively fed on carrion. What if, then, this person had been alive at the time it was swallowed? It was clear that some disaster had befallen the other tribes. Wasting no time, Vikir and Ayan journeyed to the territory of the Rococo tribe. The scene that awaited them was one of absolute horror. Warriors were strewn everywhere, their bodies showing signs of vomiting, diarrhea, and crimson spots on their skin. The most chilling detail was the complete absence of smoke rising from the village. It was a completely lifeless territory, devoid of all sound and any sign of life. The corpses in red blotches brought back Vikir's memories of an epidemic that had once decimated the barbarian population. In his previous life, it had been called the Red Death. This contagion spread with terrifying speed, wiping out nearly everyone who lacked immunity. Vikir quickly put Ayan at ease, telling her that the illness was not easily spread, which allowed them to continue their investigation. Then all of a sudden, Ayan let out a piercing scream. A small girl was standing not far from them. From her appearance, she seemed to be about 5 years of age. She was weeping over a body. She was not, however, from the Rococo tribe. Who was she? The little girl provided the answer herself, stating that she was a slave. Her name, she said, was Pomeranian, which was unusual as such a name was typically found only within the empire. The word that followed, however, struck Vikir more profoundly than anything else. She identified herself as Pomeranian La Baskerville. It is time for you to understand more about the Baskerville clan's naming conventions. Van is used for members of collateral branches. Lee is designated for men from the main lineage. Lay, however, is a name reserved for women of the direct bloodline, and it is not commonly encountered. Just such a person now stood before Vikir, a law. The Baskerville emblem was on her person. When Vikir opened the locket she wore, he discovered a photograph of Hugo, a woman, and another woman, La Baskerville, with 2 others. Unable to control his reaction, Vikir aggressively demanded, "Who are these people?" Ayan stepped in, pointing out that his hostile expression was unlikely to elicit an answer. The shock was still apparent on Vikir's face, but he realized the girl had done nothing to deserve his anger. He composed himself, asked again with a gentle smile, and Pomeranian visibly relaxed. She clarified that the people in the photograph were her mother and her grandparents. It dawned on Vikir instantly that Butler Barrymore had not been lying. At the time, he had found it impossible to believe that the patriarch was such a dedicated family man. From his first wife, Roxane, he had one daughter, Penelope, who had been abducted by barbarians. The patriarch had searched desperately for his daughter, even relocating closer to the Red and Black Mountains. He never found her, however, and eventually mourned the death of his wife, who had succumbed to illness. Vikir had dismissed the story as impossible back then, but now he was looking at living validation of that tale. Hugo's own granddaughter. The reality of the situation was becoming more and more tangible. It would be quite a sight to see the patriarch's face when, after years of warring with the barbarians, he finally meets his own granddaughter, born of them. Without a moment of hesitation, Vikir invited the little girl to come with him. Pomeranian replied that her mother had always instructed her to follow the person with red eyes. This was the precise moment that the paths of two martyrs from the Sword Clan finally converged. The lives of Vicar and Pomeranian were set to change dramatically. Vicar began to experience the full weight of paternal responsibility. It was clear to him that raising Pomeranian in the Balak village was not a viable option. They required a location that was beyond the reach of Hugo's surveillance, but not entirely cut off from civilization. He already knew he would need to make a significant request of Chihuahua. First, however, he had to speak with the matriarch. Aquila had been informed that an infectious disease was making its way through the forest. This was terrible news, especially since the rainy season was also about to begin. Vicar thought back to the Red Death from his previous life. The disease had spread so rapidly that it had even reached the Empire's borders. The Empire managed to withstand it, thanks to a wall of fire conjured by Camus Morgue. Additionally, Saint Dolores of the Quavadas family had used her divine abilities to heal the afflicted. These solutions were effective only within the Empire, while the majority of the barbarian population perished. This outcome had greatly consolidated the Baskerville family's power. The forest's ecosystem, however, was thrown into chaos, and monsters began to approach the very borders. The Baskervilles successfully defended their lands, and Hugo's authority was further solidified. This time, Vicar was determined that history would not repeat itself, because he knew the secret to halting the Red Death. Following the news of the Red Death, the most compelling events began to unfold. The young man demonstrated a simple yet vital truth to the barbarians. If a living thing is submerged in the tainted water, its body will slowly develop spots. If the water is boiled first, however, no such problems occur. Even the matriarch was grateful that the protagonist had so freely shared this valuable piece of information. Thanks to his knowledge, they could now see a path forward. It was too soon to let their guard down, however. The disease could enter the body through the eyes and mucous membranes and was also airborne. The morning mist was particularly hazardous, and with the approaching rainy season, the danger would only escalate. Consequently, there was only one viable course of action. They had to relocate the settlement. The shaman immediately protested, arguing that they could not abandon the lands of their forefathers. Vicar, however, had a strategy that would allow them to stay within their territory. The rainy season proved to be especially harsh that year, with rivers cresting their banks and inundating most of the forest. In the Red and Black Mountains, the rising water consumed everything but a single location, the village of the Balak tribe. These masterful artisans had relocated their dwellings high up into the trees, placing them beyond the reach of even the most torrential downpours. This remarkable feat was only achievable because of Vicar. Suddenly, however, a pair of eyes glowed from the watery depths. An instant later, a colossal aquatic monster breached the surface. Ayan reacted instantly, loosing an arrow at the creature and growling for the damn catfish to be gone. Interestingly, this particular fish had been regarded as the king of the forest's waters for many decades. The barbarians referred to her as Ka, and now this monster, with a powerful flick of its tail, demolished one of the structures the Balak people were constructing. Vicar did not hesitate. His sixth Baskerville technique sliced through the air, nearly striking the fish. It managed to retreat beneath the water's surface, however. Nonetheless, everyone was relieved. Vicar had successfully driven Ka away from their village. That evening, he cooked a delicious meal, once again demonstrating his care for his niece. Only one thing puzzled him. How had Ayan ended up in their home? Her portion of the meal had not been accounted for, yet she was already eating dinner with a calm sense of entitlement. Pomeranian, who was watching them intently, observed that the two of them were acting like a married couple. Ayan just smiled, clearly not opposed to the comparison, while Vicar looked on, amazed at how quickly the two had bonded. Their quiet evening, however, was shattered by the sudden arrival of Ahun. He once again required the assistance of Vicar, who had already rescued people from the village on multiple occasions. This time, however, the matter was grave. Ahun pleaded with the protagonist to save his younger sister. The girl had fallen ill the previous evening. Ahun suspected it happened while they were gathering wood for the new buildings. Ayan was distraught. This little girl had always been helpful to everyone, and now she was lying there, completely drained of strength. A shaman entered the dwelling, and rather than offering condolences, delivered a cold pronouncement. He stated that the granddaughter had gotten what she deserved for constantly defying her elders. This all happened, he claimed, because they had placed their trust in the imperial bastard, Vicar. Ahun attempted to argue back, feeling this was too much to bear. The shaman, however, refused to listen and struck the boy, ordering him to be silent. He declared this to be a punishment from the gods, and that a ritual was necessary to set things right. Vicar, however, already had a strategy to help. He issued a series of rapid commands. disinfect everything, boil the water, and create an environment where the child could effectively combat the illness. They had to stall for time. Vicar was capable of saving her, but he would need Ayan's assistance to do so. He would be required to venture outside the forest to procure a cure. Ayan pointed out that Akila would never permit him to leave so easily. The departure would have to be done in secret. The only question was whether Ayan would allow him to go. The protagonist set off at once, but the archer was right behind him. She at least needed to know his destination and why he was taking Pomeranian with him. Ayan had always deferred to Vikir and felt she couldn't demand explanations. She knew that the moment she received them, he would likely just vanish. It was vital for her to hear just one thing, though. Would he return? Vicar simply promised that he would come back. In the next instant, he was gone. Meanwhile, Chihuahua Baskerville was finding his work dreadfully monotonous. He reminisced about how challenging, yet stimulating, it had been to work alongside the young consul. He still found it hard to accept that Vicar was truly gone. Then suddenly the protagonist materialized right before him, calmly asking if he had been summoned. The meeting was so startling that the old politician couldn't stop himself from screaming. His cry must have echoed throughout the entire building. He was once again an underdog. At last, Vicar decided to confide the entire truth in his only friend. Chihuahua was ecstatic. The young hero had not only battled a forest monster, but had also integrated himself among the barbarians. The Secretary General was even moved to tears, realizing his ward was indeed alive. He was even more curious about the identity of this small child who bore such a striking resemblance to Vicar. The protagonist clarified that while they shared the same bloodline, she was most certainly not his daughter. From now on, Chihuahua would be responsible for Pomeranian's care, while also teaching her the fundamentals of survival. Should he require assistance, he was to seek out Cindy of Denaru, the very same thief Vicar had pardoned 2 years ago. But Chihuahua had one more question. When would Vicar be back? The protagonist only offered a cryptic reply, saying it would be after he had settled all of his affairs. After all, he had a promise that he was obligated to keep. The cure for Ahun's sister was a drop of holy water from the Quo Vadis clan. His next destination, therefore, was the religious lands. Everyone undergoes a meticulous inspection before being allowed to enter Quo Vadis territory. A humble merchant of oil and petroleum was not exempt from this process. Concealed within his barrels, however, was a very precious cargo, which was the source of the man's anxiety. Fortunately, the inspection proceeded without issue, and the merchant successfully reached the city of Holy Mecca. Finally, a true monster emerged from one of the barrels. As a token of his gratitude, he left the man a payment of bullfangs. I believe you've already deduced who this was. Vicar had once again opted for an unorthodox mode of transport, but he had successfully arrived in the Holy Lands. Under the Church's influence, all worldly desires, from avarice to carnal indulgence, were absolutely forbidden here. The faithful adhered strictly to all regulations, and upon the ringing of the bells, they would drop to their knees in the middle of the street. This was how Vicar managed to slip into the city's poorest districts. He carried with him the bacteria of the Red Death, which he had cultured from the sweat, blood, and tears of Ahun's sister. If this substance were to enter the well, the local population would fall ill immediately. The approach was harsh, but the circumstances were dire, and every minute was crucial. Suddenly, 3 boys caught sight of him. They immediately picked up on the danger emanating from the stranger. Vicar, however, was unfazed. He addressed the children and sternly commanded them to remember his words. This well is cursed. Anyone who drinks from it will surely die. Spread this message to everyone. The children were terrified and, without needing to be told twice, ran off screaming that a ghost had cursed the well. The young man was satisfied. Now the children would certainly avoid the water and remain uninfected. As a final touch, he left behind the dagger of the Leviathan clan, a group known for its deadly poisons. The Holy Family and the Poison Clan had a long-standing feud, so this act was sure to spark another major conflict. With all preparations in place, it was now possible to pay a visit to St. Dolores. A large crowd had formed around Dolores's palace late in the evening. The wealthy and the courtiers were pleading with her to open the gates and cure their ailments. They offered payment in the form of money, estates, and extravagant gifts. For the saint, however, this was not a sufficient reason to grant an audience at such an hour. She commanded them all to leave. Vicar stood among the throng. In his past life, he had frequently seen the saint on the battlefield, covered in blood, exhausted, yet determined to save the wounded until the very end. The Dolores he remembered, however, had loathed money and power. The protagonist knelt before the gate, adopting the guise of a lost soul. And right before him, the door swung open. A pleasant female voice from within inquired how he had lost his way. Vicar replied immediately that he had come to report on an epidemic that was spreading through the poor districts. The voice, however, suddenly accused him of falsehood. Knights appeared on the balconies, and their commander, Pedro Vadas, announced that the lost lamb was speaking with too much aggression. It had been a long time since Vicar had seen this man, the same one he had once trusted to guard his back in battle. Pedro was devoted to justice and refused to compromise with those who broke the law. The commander stated that the stranger would not be granted an audience with the saint until he had taken off his mask. Vicar had a valid reason for keeping it on. Besides, his task was complete, and he was ready to depart. The knights, however, were not about to let such a suspicious individual simply walk away. Pedro sensed that the water Vicar had brought was radiating a malevolent energy. He suspected the stranger might have intentionally started the epidemic as a ploy to draw out the saint. And Pedro was not one for lengthy discussions. He simply charged forward to attack. The protagonist was unable to use his standard abilities, as doing so would instantly reveal his identity. Consequently, he had to depend on his sword skills. He first lunged at Pedro, leveraging the 600-kilogram force of the bear. Next, he ignited the knight's magic tome with the flames of Cerberus. And finally, with a display of incredible strength, he launched his adversary directly into the fountain. The other knights were in disbelief that Sir Pedro had been defeated by some unknown person. The confrontation was abruptly halted, however. Saint Dolores herself had come out to meet the lost lamb. To her, however, he looked more like a small, scraped-up puppy. She calmly instructed that tea be brought so she could speak with this individual. Saint Dolores was currently about 16 years old. In the future, amidst the war with the demons, she would be on the front lines rescuing the injured, saving a countless number of lives. During that time, every martial artist, Vicar included, held her in high esteem. The girl explained that she had been under a great deal of stress lately. She had been attending the Colosseum and was trying to rest at home during the holidays. Nobles and merchants, however, relentlessly sought her out at all hours. They were all suffering from ailments caused by drugs or sexually transmitted diseases and were undeserving of divine intervention. Justice, fairness, and mercy were the will of God. But these people could only see what was directly in front of them. Vicar interjected, speaking of the unavoidable process of getting to know people, a process from which no one is exempt. He then brought up the epidemic that was spreading through the poorer neighborhoods. Dolores asked coolly if he himself had played a role in this. The young man displayed his magic and stated that he took no pleasure in harming the innocent, as this place was his home. The Holy Virgin was taken aback. Before her stood a devout follower. Vicar asserted that he had personally witnessed people contaminating the well. Dolores couldn't comprehend who would gain from her family's downfall. The protagonists theorized that the Leviathan clan would be the primary suspects. They could exploit the epidemic as an opportunity to eliminate their sworn rivals. One shouldn't overlook the bourgeois family either, as they would find a way to profit even from such chaos. Although everything he said was merely a theory, Dolores was astonished by this man's capacity to predict future events with such clarity. She desperately wanted to know his identity. The young man only hinted that he was known as the Night Hound. It was a sinister moniker, but his words carried the weight of truth. Therefore, the Holy House needed to urgently investigate the poor districts and relay their findings to her father. Vicar was pleased. Things would now move along much more quickly. The Holy Virgin, however, was troubled by another question. How could the man who had defeated Pedro, one of the top knights in the order, appear so small and wretched? A mix of blood, oil, and iron emanated from his soul. His cruelty and repressed anger had taken on the shade of pure hatred. Yet beneath all of this, in the depths of his turbulent emotions, there lay an immense sense of longing and sorrow. The saint went to the scene of the outbreak without delay. The epidemic was already picking up speed, with more and more people falling victim to it. Vicar felt a pang of regret that so many had to suffer. Dolores was equally shocked by what she witnessed. Her sympathy for these people was genuine, and she began to pray. Her voice, like a celestial bell, resonated throughout the church. Suddenly, one of her tears began to flash with a golden light that bathed everything around it. The afflicted were cured. Vicar was now certain of Dolores's incredible, life-giving abilities. His next task was to bring the miracle of her tears to the deep forest. The Holy Virgin knew that healing the sick with divine power was merely a temporary fix. The increasing number of afflicted could only mean one thing: a well in the poor districts had been contaminated. Furthermore, the disease had a slow but prolonged progression. To completely halt its spread, Dolores needed to create a single drop of concentrated divine power. For the time being, she went to attend to the sick, Her absolute altruism and self-sacrifice were the closest one could get to divine love. Even more difficult challenges lay ahead for her, however, because it wasn't just the patient who suffered, but the saints as well. The Holy Virgin felt ashamed for not having been there for her people all this time, but she had arrived now, and what she witnessed left her in a state of profound shock. Even the priest was convinced that nothing short of divine power could be of any help. Vikir, however, was employing some incredible techniques. The protagonist was allowing the blessing to seep into the infected area. This was a truly revolutionary discovery, and everyone began to emulate his method. Dolores had not anticipated such dedication from the Nighthound. She could never have imagined that he was so adept at wielding divine power. Well, it is time to explain the nature of this divine power. It originated from the prayer of a servant reaching God, who would then accept it and grant strength in return. The amount of power bestowed was dependent on the individual's devotion to God. Vicar, however, knew of a method to amplify this power and assist more people. In his past life, when the earth was overrun by demons, the number of casualties was overwhelming. It was then that God witnessed the desperation of the priests, who were physically unable to keep up. Slaying monsters thus became an act of faith. Even those who were not holy servants could then wield divine power to combat demons. It was because of this that Vicar was able to use it within the holy place. Meanwhile, a young girl was mourning her sick mother among the afflicted. The protagonist gave her some money, at least enough for food so she could care for her mother. The priest, however, stepped in, stating that material aid was not permissible. The desire for money is boundless. Vicar's purse, however, had its limits. He was willing to give all he had, and he felt a deep sorrow for these people. His words struck a chord with Dolores. She couldn't understand why the Nighthound spoke of regret and asked for forgiveness. Was he helping for the same reasons she was? Did he also experience pain from not being able to save more people? A sharp pang went through Dolores' heart. She was still young and lacked experience, but now her heart began to race because of the enigmatic man standing before her. After such intensive work, everyone requires a period of rest. The young man had found a secluded spot, but his solitude was short-lived. Dolores quickly located him. She wanted to speak with the man who had saved so many of the sick. The girl chose to confide her own story. Dolores felt she was simply fortunate to have been born with divine power, but she couldn't comprehend why God had chosen someone as weak as her to be a saint. Vicar responded instantly, explaining that it is precisely her suffering and sense of guilt that make her God's choice anything but accidental. The world is in need of a light that can penetrate even the most profound darkness. With all her heart, Dolores wished she could be the kind of person who could utter such words. The Cuevadas family performed their duty flawlessly. Thanks to the efforts of one young virgin, 3 drops of concentrated holy water were produced. It was named Tear of the Saint. The process was heart-wrenching for Dolores, and she could barely withstand the difficult, painful day. But now this essence of divine power would be kept under secure guard. After this, Dolores went to see her father. Cardinal Lund Humbert commended his daughter for her sacrifice. Dolores recounted all the details to him. They had finally located the source of the contaminated water. Things were not so straightforward, however. Suspicious items were discovered near the well. Emblems of the Leviathan and bourgeois clans. Humbert was livid. These fanatics had dared to desecrate the very name of God. He commanded Dolores to declare a holy war. He also ordered the capture and interrogation of the Nighthound. This stranger had aroused his suspicions. Dolores, however, refused to comply. She vouched for Vicar's innocence. This, however, was not sufficient. Humbert made a final decree. He would find and question this stranger himself. The paladins had already been dispatched to search for the Nighthound. Soon the cardinal received some troubling news. One of the saint's tears has vanished from storage. A thought crossed Dolores' mind. Is this what the Nighthound came for? Ayun had spent nearly her entire life in bondage. Kidnapped as a child, she was forced to fight in arenas, transforming her into a mere instrument for generating profit. Her life had been unbearably harsh, and that is how she found herself in a cage, being offered for sale. But then he came into her life, Vicar. He unshackled her, granting her freedom. Ayun awoke with tears in her eyes. Even in her dreams, she was plagued by nightmares where she desperately searched for Vicar. The ache in her chest was only intensifying, as if her very heart were withering away. Aquila comforted her daughter, reminding her that life is full of surprises. We must simply await Vicar's return. He will surely find a way to cure your illness. And her mother was correct. As if by a decree of fate itself, Vicar returned on that very day. Aquila had barely opened her mouth to say, "I told you so," when Ayun was already rushing to him. She could still recall the terror she had felt on the day she was freed. But Vicar had shown her how to conquer her fears. He had demonstrated that it was possible to fight back and emerge victorious. And now her savior and companion was with her once again. Ayan was filled with joy, as was Vicar himself, who had finally made his way back. Vicar went immediately to Ahun's sister. The poor girl's skin was covered in red blotches. The moment he produced the tear of the saint, however, a brilliant light filled the room. The illness vanished in an instant. It seemed this remedy truly worked. There were many more who were sick, however, and the situation in other tribes was dire. Fortunately, there was enough of the magical essence to treat everyone. Besides, Vicar had already dealt with the swamp monster Ka, but there was no time for small talk. That night, all the barbarian tribes convened at the largest lake. Vicar initiated the ritual, pouring the entirety of the saint's tear essence into the water. The lake immediately began to glow with a golden light. Now all the afflicted had to do was drink from it, and every inhabitant of the forest was able to overcome the disease thanks to the divine power. Soon the reservoirs would be cleansed, and the bacteria would be completely eradicated. Vicar had now become a true hero to the Balak people. The inhabitants of the deep forest began to prepare for a massive festival, but first they needed to uncover the most crucial piece of information: who had released the disease into the forest. Meanwhile, the shaman Ahiman was operating under the assumption that everyone had already been infected, and he was preparing to cure the tribe with his own antidote. His plan appeared to be flawless. Afterward, the people would have no choice but to worship him. Something, however, had gone awry. The village was teeming with life, and Ahiman couldn't comprehend why everything was perfectly normal. The lake water was even purer than before, and fish were abundant. How could this have possibly happened? Vicar, observing his bewilderment, asked what had so startled the shaman. Ahiman was on the verge of a furious outburst, ready to call him an imperial bastard. But then he noticed that all the villagers had gathered behind him. Akela asked with surprise how an infection created by one of the clans had suddenly appeared in the forest. Ahiman could only make excuses, claiming he was simply exercising his right to heal the tribe. It was quite surprising, then, that he hadn't even returned to the village afterward. The young man, as usual, had been correct in his assessment. He had anticipated the shaman's moves. All that was left was to determine the contents of Ahiman's sack. Could it be the very same antidote he had so painstakingly prepared? Ahiman had his motives for his despicable actions. His backstory was not a simple one. He had once been captured by a shaman from another tribe, which is how he came to join the Balak people. He later killed the very man who had been plotting a coup within the community and seized all of his power. To assimilate into the tribe, Ahiman had done whatever was necessary, and he was eventually accepted as one of them. In his later years, however, he began to crave what he had been denied in his youth. More specifically, he sought to usurp power by challenging the matriarch's authority with plans to conquer the entire forest. Now, however, he was trapped, and everyone was demanding to see the contents of his bag. Ahiman, being a crafty individual, seemingly dropped it into the river by accident. The young man had been right again, but now they lacked any proof that the shaman had actually been carrying the antidote. To establish Ahiman's guilt, it was decided that an Iliad would be held. This was an ancient method of conflict resolution, where the Balak people would side with the victor and declare the loser guilty. Tradition was unbreakable, so the duel was to be held at once. And it appears this confrontation is fraying the nerves of even the most stoic observers. The Iliad was conducted within a warrior's circle upon the sacred mountain, the final resting place of the Balak ancestors. With all the barbarians supporting Vicar, Ahiman found himself in a profoundly unfavorable position. Consequently, he summoned his skeletal warriors without a moment's delay. Their purpose was to cover his blind spots while the shaman himself circled, awaiting an opportune moment to strike. Vicar, however, had acquired a new ability, Silent Step, which he gained after slaying King Rikaka. As a result, these skeletal beings failed to detect his approach. A single perfectly placed strike sent a dagger plunging into Ahiman's body. The victor of the duel had been decided. The shaman, however, was not prepared to perish so readily. His body convulsed in torment from the blow delivered by Beelzebub. He could not stomach the idea of defeat at the hands of this imperial upstart. With his fading strength, he traced a rune on the ground using his own blood. Threatening clouds gathered around the sacred mountain as a violet luminescence filled the air. A disquieting energy rising from the graves put Aquila and Ayan on high alert. Vicar was also at a loss to understand the situation. His strike should have been lethal. Ahiman, with the fervor of a madman, began muttering strange incantations. Vicar drew back his arm to deliver the final blow once and for all. An arrow, however, suddenly landed at his feet. The shaman rasped that the ancestors themselves would now render judgment. It was time for the dead to settle this conflict. The events that follow are even more startling, so brace yourselves. This mountain was home to countless graves, and now all the ancestors had risen to stand against the living Balak tribe. Yet they had one crucial figure on their side. Aquila immediately gave the command for everyone to brace for a ferocious engagement. Her arrows were merciless. A single shot could obliterate even undead who wielded swords with the skill of high-ranking masters. The night fox Aquila was truly a magnificent sight to behold. Vicar and Ian, however, were tasked with an equally vital mission: to run down a human. The shaman's flight was not without reason. His adversary was the brilliant Aquila, the most powerful leader in the tribe's history. Even she, however, might not be able to contend with what he was about to unleash. Ahiman commenced the performance of a cryptic ritual. Ayan was not inclined to wait and intended to kill him on the spot. Her arrow never reached its target. The ritual had already concluded. The old legends had not been mere stories. The being who slumbered alone in the deep forest had finally stirred. It was the divine archer, Adonai. The young man understood at once. This was the figure from the Balak legends. His very first arrow shot directly toward our two heroes. Vicar managed to deflect it using Beelzebub. The arrowhead, however, grazed Ayan's leg, inflicting a wound that smoldered with black fire. It behaved like a potent poison. It would seem the legends were accurate. Adonai's bow was fashioned from the remnants of Madame Octopus's limbs. The circumstances were rapidly deteriorating. And of course, Vicar felt compelled to shield Ayan from harm. Meanwhile, the shaman commanded his immortal archer to eliminate everyone. That arrow, however, never found its mark. Aquila caught it with her bare hands. The chieftain had business to discuss with Ahiman. Aquila's arrival was purposeful. She had sensed an incredibly powerful aura, and her timing was perfect, as a new challenger had just appeared before them. The leader swiftly neutralized the poison contained within Adonai's arrow. She simply detonated her own aura, which purged the toxin from her blood. A masterful maneuver. Ahiman's betrayal was of little consequence to her. She had only one question. Was the figure before her truly the divine archer, Adonai? The shaman, unable to suppress his glee, shouted that it was indeed him, and that Aquila would not have the audacity to challenge him. The matriarch, however, had entirely different intentions. She immediately instructed Ayan and Vikir to stay out of the fight. It was an honor for her to face Adonai in combat and determine which of them was stronger. Wasting no time, she launched the first attack. Her arrows flew in a continuous stream, but the legendary Balak warrior dodged them with incredible agility. He immediately retaliated with powerful shots of his own. His arrows, however, also failed to find their target. It appeared this battle was destined to be a protracted one. Vicar could scarcely believe he was witnessing such a confrontation. The shaman, however, knew what to anticipate from the night fox, but he was confident she could not defeat his warrior. Adonai, after all, was already among the dead. Despite this, Aquila was fighting him on even terms. Her close-quarters combat was just as formidable as her archery. One of her arrows, however, managed to alter the battle's momentum. The great ancestor seemed to pause for a moment. It's possible he was reluctant to harm his own descendant. Regardless of the reason, Aquila knew there was only one thing she could do: release him from his current state. At the last possible second, however, a hand composed of pure darkness intercepted the arrow. It was Adonai's own body, which had resisted the shaman's spells until the very end. With Ahiman now in peril, the divine archer was compelled to fight with his full power. The divine archer's deceased form began to transform. This was no longer Adonai. A truly demonic entity now stood in his place. Monsters of A-rank classification that inhabited the forest began to gather around. It took Adonai only 3 arrows to annihilate them all. He now had a single objective: to kill Aquila. The matriarch was in a difficult position. With every blow she took, the poison of Madame Octopus spread further through her system. The night fox needed to conclude this fight as quickly as possible. Adonai, however, evaded all of her arrows. The one that was aimed directly at his head, he shattered with a single motion. Ayan grew increasingly worried for her mother. It felt as if the entire forest was resonating with the intensity of this battle. Aquila had to endure until Vicar could find a way to resolve the situation. The protagonist understood that he had to interrupt the resurrection process by killing Ahiman. The shaman, terrified of Aquila, was using Adonai as a shield and avoiding direct confrontation. Vicar, however, located him quickly. But a single blow would not be enough to kill him. Ahiman was protected by other undead beings, entities so powerful they seemed capable of taking on any emperor. Meanwhile, Aquila was taking increasingly severe damage. She could no longer remain standing and fell to her knees before Adonai. The shaman cried out that he would soon be the master of this forest. That, however, did not come to pass. The sixth Baskerville technique obliterated all the undead. And a young hero now stood before Ahiman. At the shaman's command, Adonai loosed an arrow at Vicar. Even this projectile, however, could not match his speed. Vicar was operating on an entirely different plane of existence. With a single strike, he severed Ahiman's hand. His next move was to slice the shaman's body into pieces. Adonai's body started to disintegrate. The dark magic's hold over the divine archer was finally broken. Aquila bid the great ancestor to rest in peace. The shaman's severed head was still screaming about how close he had been to victory. But Vicar finally put an end to him. Ahiman attempted to hiss out one last word, but his head was pierced by an arrow fired by his own grandson. This horrifying chapter of their story was finally at its close. The Balak tribe made their way back to the village, only to be met by a scene of utter ruin. Ahun's sister explained that while they were engaged in battle, Madame Octopus had appeared and gone on a rampage. And this was no coincidence. It became clear that Ahiman had arranged for her to show up at the precise moment of the battle. Aquila could barely keep her fury in check. Despite her grave injuries, she issued commands that were clear and intelligent. Even Ion's wolf had been hurt. The poor creature had injured its paw. Madame Octopus was truly the malevolent goddess of the forest. The Balak people had always seen her as a force of nature, a living disaster, and had never had a chance to retaliate. Vicar, however, was already formulating a new strategy. That very evening, he approached the matriarch with a single request. He wished to learn more about Madame. He had already compiled information about this giant spider. One crucial question still lingered, however. Why were all the tribes so terrified of her, and why hadn't they ever tried to band together to defeat her? Aquila spoke of ancient records detailing Adonai's battle against Madame. It was a conflict between the god of light and the evil goddess, and he had succeeded in piercing one of her legs. This, however, was merely the start of his despair. The more claws Adonai severed, the faster they regenerated on Madame. They grew back even stronger, and eventually even his arrows could no longer penetrate her hide. According to the records, everyone who participated in that battle ultimately succumbed to her poison. Aquila warned him that to attack Madame would be an act of suicide. Adonai, however, but when dealing with a powerful monster, the rules of engagement change. If he can identify this monster's vulnerability, he is certain he can kill it. The young man embarked on a true adventure, conducting surveillance on Madame Octopus. Several days of observation yielded significant results. He determined that the spiderling hunted at a specific time, which gave him a 2-hour window of opportunity. This is how he found himself at the entrance to her lair. The web proved to be incredibly durable, so the hero decided he could make use of it. Behaving like a true madman, he plunged into the deepest parts of the lair. The walls were adorned with the desiccated remains of her victims, but he had no time to examine them. A clutch of spider eggs caught his eye, a significant discovery. The young man decided to collect one for study, but just then Madame herself materialized above the lair. The situation had become extremely dangerous. It seemed the spider had instinctively detected an intruder in her territory. Fortunately, Vicar was able to conceal himself, and Madame, failing to spot the stranger, departed once more. Ayan started to become anxious. It was common knowledge that Vicar had been actively inquiring about Madame. His interest clearly extended beyond simple curiosity. This time, however, he was the one who summoned her to his tent. Inside, he had set up an entire makeshift laboratory. The young man explained that he had gathered records about the spider from various tribes and had also managed to acquire one of her eggs. Ayan understood his intentions immediately. He was preparing to fight Madame. Vicar, however, also mentioned his plans to leave the forest soon, though he might return after he has concluded his business with his family. If that was the case, then he felt the need to protect the place he intended to come back to. The plan to hunt Madame was fully formed. Ayan was well aware that Vicar consistently confronted seemingly insurmountable challenges and always emerged victorious. So on this occasion, she held no doubt about a positive result. Vicar only reinforced her conviction. Before he confronted the spider, however, there was one more critical task to be done. He sought out a particular forest monster, the salamander, and took from it the ability to regenerate. The very next day, something unexpected occurred. Vicar had vanished. Ayan immediately knew what was happening. She offered a silent prayer, asking the god of the forest to protect the great warrior, who was about to face a true catastrophe. The protagonist was certain that rain would fall soon. During such times, Madame Octopus was typically asleep, making it the ideal moment to launch an attack. The young man had already calculated every possible scenario for the hunt. He had even formulated contingency plans for any potential turn of events. The hunt for Madame Octopus had officially begun. The hero immediately engaged his Baskerville techniques, unleashing devastating strikes on the spider's legs. Just as Adonai's records had foretold, each severed limb instantly regrew to twice its original size. In that case, it was time for Vikir to implement Plan A. He delivered hundreds of blows, continuously hacking at the monster's legs, which sent the creature into a panic. Backed into a corner, Madame discharged her lethal venom. It began to course through Vickers' body almost instantly. He didn't falter, however. Though reluctant, he had to employ his newly obtained power. His severed arm regenerated in a flash. The protagonist continued to close the distance to the monster. He rained blow after blow upon the creature. His efforts were not in vain. Madame had already sprouted a multitude of extra legs to replace the ones she had lost. This was precisely the outcome he had been aiming for. Now it was time to exit her lair. Vicker knew he was no match for the spider in terms of speed. His strategy, however, relied on doubling her number of limbs. Her unique gift had now become her downfall, as too many legs were now impeding her movement. As expected, Madame attempted to use her webbing. It too was unique. Conventional fire could not harm it. It instantly vaporized, however, when exposed to the hellfire of the underworld. Furthermore, the spider's lair was thick with cadaver gas, creating the perfect environment for the flames to spread. The octopus had sullied its karma, blinded by its own strength, and the moment for its purification had finally arrived. Because Vicker had discovered Madame's weakness, all that was left was to ensure she couldn't escape from her lair. The excessive number of legs prevented the creature from moving effectively, and without her web, an escape was out of the question. The strength of its shell was irrelevant. As long as it lived and breathed, the heat and smoke swirling in the air would gradually cook it from the inside out. Now, he only had to wait for the spider's demise to claim its abilities. Suddenly, however, the mountain itself split apart. Madame had destroyed her own lair and broken out. She was now spraying poison into the sky like a celebratory firework display. The young man surmised that the monster was unable to locate him. The fire had burned away her eyes and the sensitive hairs on her body. The collapse of the mountain had also pushed her body to its absolute limits. Her shell was now riddled with deep fissures, which meant the task could still be accomplished. The protagonist took aim at one of these cracks and struck with a Baskerville technique. The force of the blow sent him reeling backward. But then something peculiar happened. Something around Madame seemed to tear, and in the next moment, Vikir could see her eyes. He had made a miscalculation. It appeared the spider could shed its old exoskeleton along with its extra legs, thereby restoring its body. Vicker understood at once. There was no time for delay. The battle had to be concluded immediately. But then he heard a strange voice. Someone asked mockingly why he was even bothering to fight this monster. It was, after all, to his benefit. He should have departed the forest long ago and focused solely on Hugo. Vengeance was his only true motivation. What's more, the soul admonished Vicker for becoming foolish and slow. It insisted that all he needed to do was recall his hatred for Hugo, the sensation of the patriarch slitting his throat. The soul had emerged to reignite the same desperation he had felt in his past life. But now he had ruined everything. The murder of Hugo and the annihilation of the Baskerville family. These were the sole objectives of his existence. Even in his previous life, he had attempted to defy Hugo's commands. In the end, however, he had walked the path his chains had laid out for him. He was nothing more than another conditioned hound. Vicker shouted that these thoughts were not his to be burdened with. Neither Hugo's directives nor his own thirst for revenge. No one else had the authority to control him. Following his execution, he had no intention of living like a bloodhound on the scent of its prey. He was filled with regret for the decisions he had made in his past life. What he truly desired was something entirely different. Freedom? He came to the realization that he only wanted to live on his own terms. He yelled at himself to get up and fight so that he would never again be controlled by anything. And just then, arrows struck Madame's legs. Warriors were standing on the mountaintop. Ayan shouted that the damn spider would not dare to touch her candidate for a husband. The Balak tribe had come to fight at his side. The warriors genuinely wanted to aid the hero of their forest. Vicker was, of course, angry that Ayan had disobeyed him, but it was because of her that he had survived yet again. Mustering all his strength, he landed a powerful strike on the crack in Madame's shell. It was still not enough. The octopus was struggling frantically. The hero had it cornered. He could not afford to stop now. Akela had always viewed Madame as a natural disaster and had never even considered trying to destroy her. But the young warriors had shown her how to conquer fear and to challenge what seemed impossible. The Night Fox would do this even if it meant reopening her own wounds. For the sake of the warriors who fought with such courage, she would clear a path for them. Her arrow flew with incredible speed and pierced Madame. Vicar charged into the attack instantly. His assault was filled with a wild frenzy. He maniacally employed every single Baskerville technique. It was as if he were shattering the very chains that had bound him for so long. All this time, Vicar had been inside Madame, and only now had he succeeded in breaking free, leaping out of her eye. The spider slowly collapsed to the ground, and the poison from her blood seeped into Vicar. It appeared that after so many attacks, the monster was struggling to retain its life force. He had to act quickly to purge the poison. Vicar unleashed Beelzebub into the spider's body. The sword completely consumed the essence of this monster. After that, he was discovered on the ground. He was intact, though utterly spent. Ian's face was alight with joy, though she was also deeply concerned for him. The celebration went on for an indeterminate number of days. The Balak people were prepared to commemorate this victory for all time. After slaying Madame, Vicar had managed to access the seventh technique of the Baskerville family. Even though he lacked the necessary skill for it, Hugo currently possessed it at the highest level of mastery, while Vickers was still in its nascent stage. He had, however, undoubtedly grown much more powerful. It is time for you to go back to your clan. The choice had been made. The matriarch herself granted the hero of their forest permission to depart. He had become a member of their family, which meant the bond between them would not fade, even with distance. At all times and in all places, he would remain a commander of the Balak tribe, a fact that should not be forgotten. That, however, was not the most important matter. Ian had not come to see him off. All the Balak people would await his return, but she had vanished. A young archer, however, was already waiting for him in a nearby field. Ian had wanted to say her farewells in private and had even prepared a parting gift. It was a new bow, the very same giant one that Adonai had used. She had modified it so that Vicar would be able to wield it. Around his neck she placed a broken chain, a token signifying that he was no longer a hound, but had become a free wolf. Ian silently leaned in close to him, and then she gave him a farewell kiss. Her eyes were brimming with tears. They parted ways, but it was not a final goodbye. One day our hero will surely return here. Vicar's first stop was the same fortress he had visited 2 years prior. This was the last place he had seen Camus Morgue. A colossal golden statue stood in the center of the village. A guard unexpectedly approached the young hero, warning him not to lay a hand on the monument. It turned out the statue had been erected to honor the hero who had saved the Morgue family, the Hound of Baskerville. The protagonist was dumbfounded. Following this, he made his way to the local tavern. His enigmatic presence immediately drew the attention of the Morgue triplets. The girls began shouting for the stranger to stop ignoring them and come over. Vicar was then ordered to lower his hood. He had, however, already intended to announce his return, so there was no reason to remain concealed. When the hero showed his face, the triplets were frozen in awe. A truly handsome man stood before them, and only one of the guards recognized him immediately as the legendary hero, Vicar. The next day, the sisters dispatched a messenger owl to the Baskerville family. Before his departure, however, Vicar wanted to inquire about Camus' well-being. He learned that she was currently engaged in training behind closed doors. The girl had abruptly departed the Hall of Light and moved to the Hall of Darkness, where she was studying magic. This news troubled Vicar, as in his past life, Camus had a poor relationship with the head of the Hall of Darkness, a man known as Snake. It seemed this was another event he had inadvertently altered. The protagonist requested that they relay a message to her to leave the Hall of Darkness and arrange a meeting with him. The news of the great hero's return spread with the speed of wildfire. It appeared that the entire empire was now aware of it. Most importantly, however, Patriarch Baskerville had now also received the news. This time, Vicar entered Chihuahua's office through the front door. The vice-consul had finally made his way back to Underdog. Pomeranian was overjoyed to see her uncle once more. The girl proudly presented a small mouse she had captured, and Chihuahua reported that thanks to Cindy, all the city's problems had been resolved. There was one issue, however, that she had been unable to fix. Recently, children from the poorer districts had been vanishing without a trace, one by one. These were clearly not kidnappings for ransom, as there had been no contact with the parents. It seemed as though the children were being taken by monsters. There was no concrete evidence, but Chihuahua was sure that a single individual was behind it all. Suddenly, a terrible thought occurred to Vicar. This series of disappearances in Underdog was distressingly similar to the situation he would be accused of in a few years' time in his past life. These events were connected in some way. His train of thought, however, was interrupted by Pomeranian. She pointed out that the mouse she had caught earlier had somehow returned to life. Vicar and Chihuahua were frozen in shock. The protagonist quickly grasped the situation. The child had drawn upon mana from another dimension. It turned out she had acquired this skill quite recently. In the Baskerville and Morgue families, children did not begin practicing magic until they were at least 8 years old. Yet the 5-year-old Pomeranian was already manipulating mana from another dimension, a rare and almost imperceptible form of power. She was a true prodigy in the art of black magic. If Hugo were to learn of this, he would have her executed without a moment's hesitation. The patriarch was all too predictable, and their paths should never be allowed to cross. Suddenly, Chihuahua was handed a letter. The news it contained was not good. Hugo was already on his way to Underdog. A long silence hung between Vicar and the patriarch. The protagonist had quickly hidden Pomeranian in the adjacent room, praying that everything would be all right. The patriarch immediately demanded to know what his son had been doing all this time. The young man replied that he had been living among the barbarians and now had a plan for their destruction. His strategy was to cut off their food supply from the empire, compelling the barbarians to hunt monsters in return for sustenance. In the end, the monsters would be driven to extinction through this process. Hugo was pleased. He had expected nothing less from his son. For the first time in a very long while, a smile graced his lips. Even the butler had not seen such an expression since the day of Vicar's disappearance. Of course, the protagonist had no desire for the Balak people to suffer at the hands of the Baskervilles. Officially, they would be recorded as having died fighting monsters. But in truth, they would simply relocate to Madame's former territory. Hugo, however, added another significant condition. He had no plans to engage in trade with the Rococo tribe. They intended to completely annihilate them. In reality, the father simply hadn't seen his son in many years, and had spent that time cursing the barbarians. So now he did not want Vicar to risk his life on the front lines again. The diplomatic advantages the Baskervilles had gained were no longer of any importance to him. Vicar expressed his gratitude for his father's concern. All of a sudden, Pomeranian burst into the room, frightened by the thunderstorm outside. Hugo shot to his feet abruptly. His face. Hugo didn't even realize that the familiar, cold mask he always wore had slipped from his face. For the first time in many years, a genuine emotion flickered in his eyes. For just a second, he thought he was looking at Penelope. Vicar immediately stepped in, urging his father to remain calm. In a steady, even voice, he explained that the girl was merely a child from one of the border tribes and had no connection to their family. Hugo finally composed himself. Yes, his daughter couldn't possibly be this young. After taking a deep breath, the patriarch decided not to stay any longer. He was tired and made his way to his quarters, but not before informing his son that he expected to see him at the grand banquet the next day. Vicar assented, left alone with his own thoughts. Sleep was difficult to find. Hugo's reaction had genuinely taken him by surprise. Perhaps it was time to tell him about Pomeranian? Regardless of what happened, his main priority was to protect his niece. Just as he was mulling this over, a figure materialized in the darkness of the room. Cindy stood before him. They hadn't seen each other in quite some time, and her appearance seemed to be for a reason. The girl had brought the information he had requested. It was the guest list for the following day's banquet. In addition to Hugo, his 2 brothers were expected to be in attendance. The first was Boston Terrier, whom we know as the commander of the Pit Bulls. The second was Gray, the commander of the Mastiffs. There was no doubt that these 2 would attempt to recruit Vikir into their respective orders. There were other guests as well, however. Osiris, the one who, in his youth, had become a perfect reflection of his father. In Vicar's past life, this boy had been as cold and stoic as a statue. And finally, Seth Baskerville. He had been in secluded training and was known for being perpetually frail and weak. Kind, gentle, he was the only member of the entire family whom Vicar respected. He would now have the chance to meet Seth. And the banquet itself was sure to be filled with interesting developments. Vicar was already present in the dining hall. The protagonist offered his formal thanks for the invitation. Hugo simply acknowledged him with a nod and directed his son to take a seat at the table. The conversation quickly devolved into a dispute between the patriarch's 2 brothers. The commanders of the 2 orders were passionately debating which one Vicar should join. In the past, offers from the Mastiffs and Pit Bulls would have been a true honor for him. Now, however, the young hero saw only 2 overconfident fools before him. The uncles were eager to see how much their nephew had developed. Hugo swiftly put a stop to their bickering so that his son could enjoy his meal in peace. Vicar calmly pointed out that his accomplishments could be easily demonstrated without ever leaving the training hall. He then proceeded to prove it in a brilliantly simple fashion. He noticed with a glance that Uncle Terrier had been served too much wine, while Dane's meat was undercooked. A moment later, the situation was rectified. He placed his hand on the table, channeled his mana, and the outcome left everyone speechless. At 17, he had achieved the rank of an intermediate expert. This was an unexpected development. He had revealed his power 2 years prior during the battle with Madame, and had assumed the news would have circulated by now. It appeared, however, that the triplets had maintained their silence. And in that moment, another astonishing event unfolded. Osiris offered his brother unexpected praise, encouraging him to maintain his current course. The shock on Vickers' face was palpable. The primary heir of the Baskerville family, cold, merciless, and the very image of Hugo, had just offered him words of encouragement. Even Seth could not conceal his astonishment. Not only had Osiris complimented someone, but he had smiled while doing so. The younger brother peered at Vicker and inquired if he was even recognized. Upon discovering that the protagonist did remember him, Seth was visibly pleased and confessed his intention to visit after the banquet, as his training was taking place near Underdog. Vicker recalled Seth vividly from his previous existence. He was the one who had stood up for him during his accusations. At this banquet, he was the sole person Vicker was genuinely happy to see. But then suddenly, a vile odor arose, a suffocating, repulsive scent that only he could identify. It was the stench of demons. It appeared a monster was concealed among the attendees. And if Vicker's senses were not deceiving him, the terrible smell originated from someone within this very hall. Vicker observed as Seth casually continued the conversation, attempting to lighten the mood. On the surface, his brother appeared just as he had in his former life. Why then did he carry the unbearable scent of demons? And furthermore, his reflection. It was absent from the polished glass. Could the real Seth be dead? His body now inhabited by a demon? Voicing such a suspicion now would be incredibly reckless. Vicker resolved to gather as much intelligence as he could. That cloying smile, however, made him feel as though icy fingers were slowly tightening around his throat, leaving him breathless. Fortunately, Osiris created a diversion, and Vicker was spared from enduring the sickening stench any longer. Following this, the patriarch himself requested his presence in his office. The 5-hour-long dinner had left Vicker thoroughly drained. He suspected his father wished to talk about his matriculation at the academy. Before his meeting with Hugo, however, another unexpected encounter awaited him. The triplets were lying in wait for him just outside. Vicker braced himself for a confrontation, yet rather than launching an attack, they knelt. The gesture resembled a knightly vow of fealty. The brothers had come to settle a debt. During the assault on the forest monster, they had experienced, for the first time in their lives, not just terror, but also profound respect. On that day, they resolved to become the three spears of Vicar van Baskerville. They implored the protagonist to take them into his service, swearing their eternal loyalty. In a past life, these three had posed a lethal danger to Vicar. Now, however, he required no such pledges. The fact that they would be allies from this point forward was something best kept quiet. The triplets were ecstatic to have their wish granted. Vicar's mind, however, was preoccupied with a single thought. The demon that had usurped Seth's body, no matter the cost, that monster had to be destroyed. But first, he went to see the patriarch. The Colosseum Academy stood as the most prominent educational institution in the entire empire. Vicar had previously walked its halls as a servant to the triplets, enduring the disdainful glances of the nobility. Those memories, however, no longer held any power over him. Hugo had honored his promise. Vicar was headed to the academy. The triplets would be accompanying him. Before his departure, however, the protagonist wished to claim his reward. The Morgue family had pledged compensation for his disappearance, but material wealth held no interest for Vicar. He desired only to hear a story. He wanted to know more about Miss Roxanne and Penelope. Hugo became guarded. If his son's inquiry was born of simple curiosity, then Vicar, however, requested that he tell the tale first and ask for his reasons afterward. It was plain to see that this was more than just idle curiosity. The patriarch let out a deep sigh. Roxanne was the only woman he had ever truly loved, and Penelope was his most cherished treasure. Theirs was not a marriage of political alliance. She was a common girl with neither title nor fortune, yet Hugo recalled their first encounter as if it were yesterday. It had been love at first sight. They had faced their trials as a couple. The Baskerville family had hunted them, dispatching guards, but he had fought to the death to keep Roxanne safe. Together they surmounted every challenge, and from their love, Penelope was born. He did everything in his power to protect his happiness. Roxanne's health, however, began to decline, and she eventually departed from this world. Fortunately, their daughter blossomed into a kind and radiant young woman. For Hugo, it was enough to know she was well. One day, however, that all changed. Penelope went out for a walk and never returned. She had been abducted by barbarians from the Rococo tribe, who had somehow infiltrated the very heart of Baskerville lands. To this day, Hugo had never found any trace of her. The patriarch fell into silence before turning to Vikir, demanding to know the reason for his interest. The protagonist silently produced the medallion and passed it to his father. He recognized the object immediately. He had crafted it for Roxanne himself and later gifted it to Penelope. The young man then asked, "What would you do, father, if you learned that Penelope's descendant was alive?" He stated calmly, "The patriarch has a grandson." Pomeranian then ran into the hall. When he discovered this girl among the Rococo barbarians, she had called the one who gave her the medallion mother. Vicar had expected Hugo to be utterly floored by this revelation. Would he be able to maintain his composure in the presence of his own granddaughter? Her lineage was undeniable. If she was born among the Rococo, it meant her mother had formed a union with a barbarian. It was the unadulterated truth, and Vikir wanted to witness his father's despair. This was supposed to be the moment his revenge truly began. Events, however, unfolded differently. Hugo and Pomeranian established an immediate rapport, with the girl casually calling him Grandpa. Osiris and the butler observed this exchange with pure delight. Vickers simply stood by, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The Hugo he knew had simply vanished. What was that expression on his face? Why did he appear so genuinely joyful? This was something Vicar could not understand. This day should have been a devastating one for the patriarch of the Baskervilles. So why was he laughing with what seemed to be true happiness? Why did he not look distraught? The butler was sincerely thankful to the young master. He never imagined he would see a smile on Hugo's face again. And Vicar couldn't grasp how he himself had been the catalyst for all of this. The protagonist stood before his father, who was now utterly exposed. Why then did he suddenly feel so powerless? Why was his resolve for revenge suddenly wavering? Even Cindy was taken aback. It was the first time she had ever seen such listlessness on her boss's face. The girl's late-night arrival was not without reason. She had already compiled all the necessary intelligence on Seth, and through a thorough investigation, she had uncovered something quite compelling. The Baskerville heir had been secretly funding orphanages under a false name. There was, however, no record of what happened to the children who were taken from those institutions. If Seth was indeed a demon, it appeared he had been abducting children for his own nefarious purposes. What was even more alarming was his connection to the case of the missing children in Underdog, a detail Vicar had overlooked. This implied that even in his past life, he had been unknowingly in the service of a demon. Seth had always expressed sympathy for him. This just couldn't be true. The evidence, however, all pointed to the same conclusion. Seth had in fact been kidnapping children. He would bring them to his cave, where something horrifying would take place. The creature was feeding. Seth was one of the 10 elite demons, Andromelius. What he had already done was not enough for Seth. The demon aspired to build an entire organization dedicated to raising children like livestock. The 8th demon was, of course, opposed to this, deeming it too great a risk. Humans might discover their existence. The monster also cautioned him against broadcasting his stench, as the Baskervilles possessed an exceptionally sharp sense of smell. Seth, however, had anticipated this and had placed traps around his hideout. The 10 elite corps were supposed to be concentrating on opening the gates that would bring about the world's ruin, all in the name of humanity's destruction. With that, the 8th demon vanished. Seth, however, remained unsatisfied. Vicar was a problem, and he needed to be eliminated as soon as possible. In the meantime, Vicar was walking with Hugo. The patriarch was well aware of the depth of his son's hatred for him. He had consistently treated his own offspring like hounds of war, dispatching them on perilous missions. His cruelty toward Vicar had begun in the boy's childhood, all driven by his desire for vengeance against the barbarians. But now the patriarch was asking for forgiveness and offering his sincere gratitude. This sense of relief had come about only because of Pomeranian. For this reason, Vicar could ask for anything he wished, not as a reward for a hound, but as a token of genuine appreciation. From the moment of his return, the protagonist knew that the cold, ruthless Hugo was gone. This realization, however, only pushed him further into a state of confusion. Which path should he choose, revenge or forgiveness? First, he had one critical matter to conclude. To do so, Vicar would require the patriarch's assistance. Meanwhile, Seth paid a visit to Pomeranian. Hugo had in fact given strict orders that no one was to approach his granddaughter. The second heir, however, requested that his visit be kept confidential. The girl's hair brought to mind the patriarch's daughter. The nanny, however, immediately realized that Seth had not even been born at that time and could not possibly have known her. The demon knew at once that he had slipped up, but quickly rectified the mistake by frightening her into silence. The monster spoke openly of the Pomeranian's resemblance to Hugo's daughter and wife. How amusing. If he were to kill her, how much agony would the patriarch endure? Seth was unexpectedly cut off. Osiris appeared at the very moment his brother was alone with Pomeranian and asked with surprise what he was doing there. The demon immediately went on the defensive, claiming the nanny was gone when he arrived. Osiris knew full well that Hugo would be furious if he learned of this, so the brothers agreed to keep the matter between them. Despite the circumstances, Osiris expressed genuine concern for Seth and even offered his help. These words, however, stung the demon like poison, reaching its very core. He departed at once. Osiris let out a heavy sigh. For the first time in his life, he had openly admitted his concern. As a descendant of the patriarch, he had always striven to emulate his father. But now the man he had known as cold and emotionless was permitting himself to show his feelings. Osiris desired this as well, to live without the pretense of a mask, to express the emotions that churned within him. And all of this was made possible by the arrival of a little girl in the Baskerville family. Meanwhile, Seth was seething with rage. He had a perfect opportunity to eliminate Pomeranian, but the damned Osiris had unexpectedly intervened. There was still ample time, however. He just needed to find a method. Should he poison her, as he had once done to Roxanne, and stage it as an accidental death? Should he use barbarians, as he had in Penelope's case? No. This time he wanted to dispose of the last girl of the Baskerville line in the most brutal way imaginable. Suddenly a signal interrupted his thoughts. Someone had triggered the trap surrounding his cave. Seth was instantly on high alert. Who could have found this place? Vicar entered the cave with a calm demeanor. He was keeping his promise to pay his brother a visit. The protagonist explained that he had been observing him for some time. But now he was curious. What was his brother doing in such a disorderly place? It was almost as if he were the very demon responsible for the disappearances of children in the town of Underdog. Seth seemed to light up. Could his little brother truly know everything? Vicar was surprised that the demon no longer bothered to conceal its true identity. What astonished him even more, however, was Seth's unwavering confidence. Since Vicar had arrived without backup, he must not object to being carved into pieces right now. Before he could even complete the thought, Vicar severed his hand with a single, fluid motion. A searing pain shot through Seth, as if his very soul had been torn out. What was this? How could this boy possess a relic of the great Lord of the Flies? Vicar just shook his head. This was precisely the level of knowledge he anticipated from a member of the 10 Elite Corps. Seth's insides recoiled even further as he detected a familiar scent in the air. The boy's soul reeked of the blood of his kin. Could he really have journeyed to hell itself? The protagonist gave him no time to contemplate. He calmly instructed the demon to awaken. He would not be allowed to die so easily. In Vicar's past life, the world had been consumed by chaos. A gateway had opened in the heavens, linking the human realm to the kingdom of demons. When they commenced their invasion, it was dubbed the Fall. The ones who had opened the gate were the 10 most powerful demons, the first to step onto Earth. During the prolonged war against the demons, Vicar had encountered one of them. The battle's outcome was tragic. Of 667 soldiers, only one survived, while 666 perished. Who could have imagined that in this life, Vicar would face one of those demons in a full decade early? He surveyed his surroundings. Did all these skeletons belong to children? A storm of rage began to build within him. Seth noticed this at once and smugly announced that they were all inside of him now. And if Vicar was so distressed, perhaps the demon could bring them back. A sharp swing of the sword was his answer, and the demon's hand was sent flying to the ground. It regenerated within seconds, however. Seth now understood that his opponent was not to be taken lightly. His power, combined with the presence of the great Lord of the Flies relic, meant only one thing. Vicar had to be eliminated immediately. Vicar himself, however, had no intention of dying so easily. Employing the 7th Baskerville technique, he left Seth utterly astonished. The demon had no idea a son from a collateral line was capable of such a feat. Vicar, however, knew the mindset of demons. They invariably viewed humans as inferior beings and considered themselves invincible. Deceiving an arrogant monster, therefore, was a simple task. In his past life, the heroes who had sealed the demon gates had failed to locate and eliminate the 10 Elite Corps. But now, before the fall has even occurred, These beings are in hiding. The young man asked the demon if he would feel even a sliver of relief if he were to destroy all of his comrades and sabotage their plan. An overwhelming fear gripped Seth. He was being intimidated by a mere human. Was such a thing even possible? Without providing an answer, he dissolved into a swarm of blood spikes. This was so he could reappear before Vicar in his true form. His gaze burned with malice. He hadn't anticipated this level of power from the boy. But this was not the end. Demonic serpents swarmed around Vicar and began a relentless assault. One of them managed to land a bite. A sinister smile spread across Seth's face. That was it. His power was derived from the endless absorption of blood. This ability was intrinsically linked to the fluid. If Vicar were to lose all of his blood, he would simply perish. Vicar maintained his smile, a fact that infuriated Seth to no end. The demon couldn't fathom what could possibly be amusing about the situation. It was quite amusing to Vicar, however, how this self-satisfied monster had no idea what it was actually ingesting. Suddenly, the demon's body seemed to seize up from within. He realized with dawning horror that this was no ordinary blood. Meanwhile, Vicar theatrically activated his regeneration, further stoking his opponent's panic. The demon couldn't comprehend how a simple human could possess such a diabolical skill and a poison that could harm even demons. The only beings known to possess such a deadly toxin were a cunning spider from the Red and Black Mountains, a 9-headed hydra, and a giant jellyfish from the depths of the Black Sea. It now became clear. Madame's poison was potent enough to affect even the 10 elite corps. The spider herself, it seemed, was enraged that her venom had failed to finish off its target. That was more than enough for Vicar, however. By merging the 7th Baskerville technique with the powers of Beelzebub, he could already stand as a worthy adversary to the 10 elite corps. Seth could not wrap his head around how this boy had amassed such strength. In his current predicament, there was only one course of action: flee and alert the other demons to this spy's existence as quickly as possible. But Vicar was given no respite. He was now surrounded by blood warriors. All of these beings wielded the 6th Baskerville technique, which Seth himself had once mastered. The demon had made his decision. He would kill Vicar and then eliminate everyone he held dear. The situation was indeed worsening, but Vicar was prepared for it. He produced a black whistle. It was the same one that Seth, as a member of the Baskerville family, recognized instantly. A sharp, unbearable sound sliced through the air, echoing throughout the mountain. This time, Vicar had utilized the whistle's second function to mobilize all of the family's forces. And in an instant, the entire mountain trembled from a powerful impact. Hugo finally understood why his son had requested that particular whistle. It was for the purpose of slaying a demon. The entire family stood frozen, awaiting the command. And Vicar gave it: tear the monster to pieces. All the hounds were briefed on the demon's abilities, but were under strict orders not to sustain a single scratch. It was this very command that ignited the soldiers' fighting spirit. Meanwhile, a heavy weight settled in Hugo's soul. How could he have failed to see that his son had become a demon? What was the state of the Baskerville family? The demon, realizing his situation was dire, frantically searched for an escape. He began to plead for a bargain. If he were allowed to go free, he would vacate Seth's body. Vicar regarded him with skepticism. Would anyone actually fall for such nonsense? Andromelius, however, knew he didn't need to persuade everyone. One would be sufficient, so he addressed Osiris. The monster preyed on the older brother's emotions, reminding him that he wouldn't let his younger brother be killed. Seth's memories were accurate. Osiris was the kindest member of the family, and this was now his final opportunity to save his brother. Osiris drew closer. The demon immediately began to impersonate Seth, speaking in his voice and insisting he was still alive. He started to beg for forgiveness for selling his soul to the demon, pleading for a chance to atone. Osiris, however, did not even listen. The blade of his sword was the only reply. He felt a deep sadness. But this was the only thing he could do for Seth. Vicar told Osiris that he shouldn't hold himself responsible. But he understood that he was the one to blame for everything. If only he had looked after his brother more carefully in his youth. Suddenly a hound cried out. The monster's head had been sent flying. Even in its final moments, the demon let out a smug laugh. His brothers would surely fare much better. The young man knew at once. He couldn't make that shot from this distance. But then Hugo spoke, stating that a swordsman should never turn his back. The demon shuddered. Where was this strange sensation coming from? Why was he so terrified? And then he understood. This was the instinct of the weaker in the presence of the stronger. Hugo swung his sword. A single blow was all it took to dispatch the demon. This was Hugo's holy sword, the Baskerville. It was the true power of the swordmaster. The very next day, the news spread to every inhabitant of the Baskerville territory. It concerned the sins of the patriarch's second heir, Seth. The truth of his demonic nature was, of course, kept hidden, but he was charged with a multitude of crimes. And this event served as another reminder that the laws of the Baskerville family were applied to all, without exception. Osiris was placed in charge of the investigation. In truth, however, a loyal assistant, Vicar, was operating behind the scenes. Within a week, the two of them had resolved all the critical issues. Now that no trace of demons remained among the Baskervilles, they could finally breathe easier. Vicar, however, still tasked Cindy with finding any information on other hidden monsters. Osiris was filled with pride for his younger brother. This incident, however, had postponed his departure for the academy. But Vicar was not to worry about family matters. This was the patriarch's decision. Osiris explained that their father feared his youngest son would become entangled in political schemes and power grabs. And surprisingly, the older brother had recently started to understand his father. Hugo had always genuinely cared for them. He just had no idea how to express it. Vicar's attention shifted to his father. He was carefully braiding his granddaughter's hair, and Pomeranian was beaming with joy. The protagonist once again viewed everything through the lens of his past. He had once lived in bondage, seeing only Hugo's back and obediently following it. That was why he had never realized that the patriarch himself also wore his own collar. But he knew more now: experience, fate, despair, and most importantly, hope. This is the emotion that floods you when you are finally freed from your chains. And now Vicar understood the most crucial thing. The Hugo he had so desperately wanted to take revenge on no longer existed. The past no longer had a hold on him. He smiled with satisfaction and accepted Osiris's offer to attend the academy. The past, however, still hadn't completely released its grip. His true vengeance was only just beginning. It was aimed at those who had been the source of all his troubles from the very start. At last, the day of the entrance ceremony for Coliseum Academy had come. The student body at the academy was split into two divisions. The Ice Squad, composed of experts in swords, spears, bows, and any other cutting or piercing weapon. And the Fire Squad, which was made up exclusively of magicians. This year, several new names stood out during the entrance examinations. Among them were Tudor from the Don Quixote family, a master of the sword, and Bianca from the Usher family, a legendary archer. Following them were the Baskerville triplets. Another rising star was the sorceress Sinclair, who had placed first in the practical exam and second in theory. The top student in the theoretical category, however, was an unknown boy named Vicar. The protagonist had intentionally concealed his surname to avoid drawing unwanted attention, so he was assumed by everyone to be a commoner. He had made this choice so he could navigate the academy freely without raising any unnecessary suspicion. At the heart of all this academic activity was the academy's president, Dolores Quavadas. She was the one person Vicar had to avoid at all costs. Forgive this large influx of names and details. Later, they will all coalesce into a coherent picture. Vicar was assigned a room with Piggy, a boy he remembered fondly from his previous life. Piggy had always been kind and genuine. In the past, when Vicar was serving the triplets, this boy had consistently offered him help. Back then, Piggy was tormented by his roommate, and that was only the start of his hardships. This time, however, things would be different. As soon as they met, Piggy began to chatter about the party for new students. Vicar listened but had no plans to attend. The boy tried every trick to persuade him, even sharing gossip about the most popular students. The protagonist, however, remained firm in his decision. I did manage to confirm that Piggy was, as before, a true master at gathering information. He even confessed that he wished he could learn the same level of detachment. Vicar, however, was not one for idleness. He had an important task to attend to, a meeting with Ron. 4 years ago, he had murdered a neighboring family, sacrificing them to forge a contract with a demon. The young man severed both of his hands in a single motion. He was interested in the specific creature with which the man had struck a deal. Ron, however, never had the chance to speak. His head detonated. This was the third suspect to explode right in front of him. It was no coincidence. Vicar's blacklist, which he had created with Cindy, held the names of all who served demons and had betrayed humanity. By the time of the Empire's fall, every last one of them was to be eliminated. The fact that 3 suspects had exploded before he could kill them indicated only one thing. It was the work of a demon's special ability. And this demon was lurking somewhere within the capital itself. In a single night, Vicar had investigated 29 suspects. And each time one of them attempted to speak the demon's name, their head would explode. This seemed to be a specific clause in their contracts. There was no new intelligence, but what more could be expected on the first day? The protagonist thus decided to head back to the academy. To his surprise, the welcome party for new students was still in progress. The young man decided to look in just in case. He immediately came across two familiar faces from his past. Even in his previous life, he had been unaware that these two were the same age. They were the heroes who, alongside Camus Morgue, had led humanity to victory. One of them was Tudor, a descendant of the Don Quixote family, a sword prodigy and a human bulwark on the front lines. The other was Bianca, a legendary archer from the Mystic family, who had slain countless demons. Vicar recognized many of the guests. They had all, at one point, stood with him on the fields of battle. One question, however, weighed most heavily on his mind. Had Camus Morgue enrolled at the academy? His musings were cut short by an unpleasant sight. The upperclassmen were forcing Piggy to consume alcohol. If the boy could down it in one go, they promised not to make him sing. He had no other option, so Piggy took a drink, but immediately threw it all up onto the floor. They had already bestowed a demeaning nickname upon him. Suddenly, Vicar was there, covering the mess with his cloak. Last time, Piggy had been forced to leave the academy, unable to withstand the constant humiliation. He had then taken a job as a minor official, caring for his elderly parents. They had met again later, however, this time on the front lines, where Piggy had become one of the few who volunteered. His strategic mind had saved an incredible number of lives, and that level of respect was thoroughly earned. The protagonist calmly told his friend to return to the dormitory. He could not simply watch as he was being demeaned. The upperclassmen naturally were not pleased. One of the students struck Vicar across the cheek, muttering that he was getting too bold. Hugo's triplets were already simmering with rage. Someone had dared to lay a hand on their master. Before they could intervene, however, Vicar forbade them from revealing his status. Otherwise, it would be the end for them. Then one of the older girls proposed a solution. If the newcomer would drink for two, they would be allowed to leave. The protagonist silently lifted his glass and began to drink. The upperclassmen whispered among themselves that the glass was filled with the most potent, fiery concoction. Vicar emptied his glass, took Piggy, and turned to leave. Suddenly, a hand gripped his shoulder. It was at this moment that the two most powerful students, Bianca and Tudor, felt a terrifying surge of energy. Vicar, with a quiet yet firm composure, asked what more they wanted from him. There was no reply. Hugo's triplets were ecstatic. The scene was nothing short of legendary. Those two simply dismissed the event. Sinclair, however, knew at once that she had encountered someone truly remarkable. At the academy, the Ice and Fire squads shared their lecture halls. This arrangement fostered a unique atmosphere of constant competition among the elite. The professor of combat theory had just concluded a lecture on the cultures of barbarian tribes. His question was straightforward. Where might the stronghold of these tribes be situated? Tudor struggled with theoretical subjects. Bianca was not known for her academic prowess either. Sinclair, however, could answer any query with clear, confident, and unwavering accuracy. As she spoke about tribal customs, Vicar's mind was somewhere else entirely. The horrors of the previous night replayed in his mind. 29 bodies, all possessed by demons, each with an exploding head. If this was indeed the work of one of the 10 elite corps, then he already had an idea of where they might be concealed. His train of thought, however, was broken by Piggy. The professor grew angry, believing the student had fallen asleep during the very first lecture. Vicar calmly stated that he had not been dozing. This only served to further enrage the teacher, who was now convinced a true psychopath had been admitted to the academy. So he decided to make an example of the insolent student. If his answer was incorrect, the entire squad would suffer a point deduction. The question pertained to the stronghold of the enigmatic Balak tribe, about which very little was known. Vicar, however, delivered an answer of flawless precision and detail. The professor was momentarily frozen. What was this? It was a theory that had yet to receive validation from the scientific establishment. It dawned on him that the student who had achieved the highest mark on the theory examination was sitting right before him. Observing such intelligent individuals made Tudor's fist clench. He wondered if this bookworm would have any prowess in a practical setting. Rugby was a favored sport at the academy, though played without the use of mana manipulation or weapons. And in this particular game, Tudor was the undisputed star. He wanted to avoid a direct confrontation with the Baskerville monsters, so he maneuvered around the triplets. And then he set his sights on Vicar. He decided to have a bit of fun with him, to see how this supposed nerd would fare. The moment he made contact, however, he was sent flying and lost consciousness. It happened in an instant, and Vicar realized his display might look suspicious. Therefore, he also feigned being a victim without a moment's thought. Tudor was completely bewildered. He had no idea what had just transpired. He could only recall one thing: his intention to collide his shoulder with that nerd. And now he was certain he needed to reevaluate his hypothesis. Even the girls watching from the sidelines had observed that the fencer wasn't charging for the ball, but directly at Vicar. This time, the Baskerville triplets attempted to intervene, but their efforts were futile. Tudor had employed the signature running technique of the Azure Spear family. The final image he registered before his world went dark was Vicar's calm, utterly unfazed expression. He regained consciousness after the game had concluded, with a giant figure standing over him, his friend Sancho, who had carried him from the field. Sancho understood his friend's predicament well. Something was not right with this new student, and this time he intended to uncover the truth himself. Sancho Barataria, a member of the Northern Trade Guild Association, was renowned for his extraordinary physical prowess. As a matter of principle, he did not play rugby. But after his friend had been taken out of the match for a second time, he chose to make an exception. The triplets were already on high alert. Sancho, however, like a force of nature, effortlessly brushed all three of them aside. And now he was hurtling straight for Vicar. He wanted to see if this nerd could withstand a genuine impact. The moment he made contact, however, it felt as if he had run into a mountain. He stood there stunned, unable to believe what had just happened. Vicar knew he had to play along with the situation, so he pretended to be genuinely injured and collapsed to the ground. Sancho remained in a state of shock, and the triplets seized this opportunity. The victory was now decisively theirs. Water was poured over Vicar's head to revive him, and Sancho declared that the unsung hero who secured their win should not be left on the sidelines. Tudor jestingly asked him to show at least a little happiness, since he had forced him to back down. What stunned Sancho the most, however, was the condition of Vicar's body. It was as solid as a mountain, and for a second he thought the boy had used mana. But Vicar insisted, with no offense intended, that he was just a commoner. The protagonist removed his glasses as he rested, completely unaware of what was to come. From this point forward, the academy would transform from a mere place of learning into the stage for a real adventure. That very evening, the Night Hound encountered a peculiar creature. A ghastly odor and waves of dark energy saturated the air. Could this be one of the elite corps? The protagonist's new adversary was indeed exceptionally powerful. Its aura was at an expert level, and the techniques it employed were those of the Quavadas. This was a clear indication that the individual before Vicar was not one of the elite corps. So who could it be? The protagonist pondered this with a growing sense of dread. Had a demon truly managed to infiltrate a religious nation? And if he could eliminate this servant, perhaps he would finally come face to face with the demon itself. It had been a long time since Vicar had allowed his emotions free rein, and now seemed like the perfect time to indulge. His strikes were precise, swift, and devastatingly powerful. Even as the demon's servant attempted to flee, Vicar kept it within his sights, offering no chance of escape. The creature was mortally wounded. He spotted a name carved into its flesh. The protagonist wondered with surprise, who would turn a Phoebo into such a monster? The answer, however, was obvious. The demon exerted complete control over its minions, down to the smallest detail, even influencing their speech. Words, however, cannot resolve everything. And Vicar knew of methods far more effective than conversation, methods he much preferred. Amidst the debris, the hero encountered another man, a purveyor of poisons. This time Vicar was determined to learn everything. They were not alone, however. Someone was already tailing them. The merchant consented to talk and even managed to shout something about the manager's office and a safe. It was too late, though. A demonic energy suddenly warped the space around them. Vicar sensed it immediately, and the man who had just tried to help was transforming into something bizarre. No, into a living bomb. And it was already detonating. The explosion was heard by law enforcement officers. Among them was Saint Dolores, and they all rushed to the scene at once. This was clearly no ordinary event. The signs of a battle extended even to the shelter. The question that arose was, what kind of evil had they been fighting there? Dolores made an unexpected discovery. She was visibly stunned by what she found and quickly concealed the item. There was no question about it, however. This mask belonged to the Night Hound. The explosion had allowed Phoebo to erase his trail. The only thing left for Vicar was the ledger from the shelter director's safe. It was filled with horrifying entries, addresses and personal information of children who were being served as food for demons. Most importantly, Vicar recognized the silhouette of the person he had spotted on the roof the previous night. It was without a doubt a student from the academy, and possibly one of the elite corps. But while someone lurked in the shadows, the academy's attention was focused on another matter. The new edition of the renowned capital's newspaper was on its way. It was produced by the team of the Lukian Newspaper Club, a project of considerable influence. The club's leader was Saint Dolores, a third-year student known for her flawless reputation and commanding charisma. She was now addressing the new members. To be brief, as you are already familiar with most of them, Tudor joined because he aims to be first in everything. Sancho joined because he was weary of being seen as nothing more than brawn. Sinclair viewed the club as a means to gain power. Bianca was drawn to their straightforward way of thinking. And Piggy simply reveled in analyzing information. The club was a perfect match for him. Vicar had merely tagged along with his friend. In truth, however, he knew full well that this was where he could acquire the data he needed. The only thing he disliked was the presence of Dolores. The tranquility did not last long, however, as everyone immediately recognized Vicar. Anna, a colleague of the Saint, had published a whole article about him just the day before, the hot new student who had taken out Tudor in a rugby match. Journalists, however, are never idle. The newcomers were promptly given their first task. They were to write a piece on the explosion in the burned-out shelter. The initial step was to come up with a headline. The new members, however, were short on ideas. All their suggestions were either too morbid or too unoriginal. And then Dolores whispered softly, "Night Hound." This was the very mask she had discovered at the site of the explosion. Its owner was that same quiet stranger, humble, poor, yet willing to lay down his life for others. She was convinced the Hound had a reason for stealing the Saint's tear. Even if he was a criminal, he had a motive. Anna concurred. Night Hound sounded powerful. Swinging, enigmatic, and slightly menacing, exactly what they needed. It was only then that Dolores realized she had spoken her thought aloud. Tudor glanced at Vicar and asked for his opinion. The protagonist feigned indifference. Internally, however, he had already made up his mind. This Hound was certainly no hero, and therefore, he must be a thief. Suddenly, Dolores looked up and asked sharply where Vicar had gotten such confidence. The young man couldn't offer a clear reason for his certainty. Dolores was quick to remind them that as journalists, their duty was to report only verified information. A single careless word, after all, could destroy someone's life. Therefore, to accuse the Hound of the explosion and the deaths of the children was going too far. The Saint maintained a neutral stance, even though the destroyed shelter had ties to her family. Just then, she was urgently summoned by one of the instructors. He demanded a definitive answer. The Hound is guilty, full stop, and he wanted the article published the next day with this message. Dolores, however, was not one to back down so easily. She went to negotiate, and in that moment, she carried herself like a true queen. This was exactly how Vicar remembered her from his past life, when she had led armies to the front lines. He had been worried that the Saint would interpret the Hound's actions as malicious, but this girl was only interested in the truth. Meanwhile, the rhythm of life at the academy went on. Every morning began at 6 with the sound of a siren, calling everyone outside for exercises with an instructor and a short run. After their morning routine, they had free time. The four friends were taking a walk around the campus. Tudor, Sancho, and Piggy were discussing their weekend plans, hoping to escape to the city for some relaxation. Vicar, however, had to work, mandatory volunteering. One of the instructors clearly had it out for him and would find fault with him for any reason. Vicar told his comrades to go on without him. They didn't even consider it, however, deciding that volunteering also sounded interesting and that they wouldn't desert their friend. Tudor couldn't deny the pull he felt toward Vicar. He was like an older brother, calm, self-assured, with an inner strength. Vicar already projected the aura of a natural leader. And it was these boys, who would later become heroes, who were the first to align themselves with him. Then suddenly, a pungent odor spoiled the moment. Vicar knew instantly who he was dealing with. He asked Piggy for the identity of this person. It turned out to be Bane, a second-year student who was considered the most handsome boy at the academy. The thought of attacking even crossed Vicar's mind. It was too great a risk. However, especially with his friends nearby, he abruptly claimed to feel unwell and departed. His thoughts were consumed by Bane, and that is precisely why he failed to notice Dolores until she collided with him at full speed. The poor girl tumbled down the stairs, feeling as though she had run into a stone wall, and this wall hadn't even budged. Who was this Vicar? Meanwhile, Bane himself had led the girls to a secluded area. He claimed he wanted to confide something personal. A strange guy, he said, had appeared and was constantly bothering him. He couldn't even eat properly because of him. And it seemed this guy had already figured out that Bane was from the academy. The girls were moved and promised him their unwavering support. It was too late, however. The creature had already begun to consume its victims, slowly and methodically. Bane was certain that the mysterious boy in the plague mask was connected to Andromelius's death. Now, a little more about the ninth corpse, Dantalion. He commanded an extensive network of servants who were gathering intelligence on the plague doctor. This was the same stranger who had suddenly started meddling in his affairs. He had been acting much more cautiously since the explosion, but he was still a threat. Dantalion's specialty was his collection of faces, which he gathered as others might collect trophies. And now he had instructed his slaves to scour the city and locate the plague doctor. His actions had led to the death of the 10th corpse, forcing a delay in the opening of the gate, a fact that greatly annoyed the demon. He desperately needed an outlet for his frustration. Soon, Dantalion had a meeting with Dolores. This time, he was wearing the face of Sir Quitley, the head of a collateral branch of the Quavadas family. The saint could not abide this man. He made a profit from the sins of the wealthy, selling them purification for exorbitant sums of money. And as Dolores said, no God will save people like that. Quitley only responded coolly that his actions were in line with church teachings. That marked the end of their conversation. Internally, however, Dantalion was struggling to control himself. He had a desperate desire to add Dolores's face to his collection. To him, she was the most beautiful thing in this world. And he fantasized about seeing the despair in her eyes at the moment the world was turned upside down. That was why he needed to open the gate as soon as possible. In the meantime, Vicar had made his way to the shelter. Cindy had pinpointed this location by analyzing the records left behind by the first demon in Seth's body. The sanctuary, however, belonged to the Holy Family of Quavades, which confirmed that demons had now infiltrated all the major clans. For Vicar, this was an opportunity to better observe his comrades and the location itself. The situation, however, was far from straightforward. This shelter was on an entirely different scale. It was the largest in the capital. Its director was a person of considerable standing in church circles and a rather influential figure. Vicar's friends were aware of the long-standing feud between Quitley and Dolores, which stemmed from their differing beliefs. The protagonist himself was focused on only one thing. As soon as he met the director, everything would become clear. First, however, it was time to get acquainted with the children the volunteers would be spending the next 10 days with. Bianca and Sinclair were standing nearby. It seemed the girls had also decided to join the volunteer effort. Sinclair immediately approached Vicar, eager to get to know him better. She was practically beaming with joy when the boy agreed. As it turned out, however, things were a bit more complex. Piggy informed him that the blonde had specifically orchestrated events so she could be with Vicar. The protagonist now knew he had to be more cautious around Sinclair. At last, it was time to meet the children. Vicar immediately stood out from the other volunteers. The children were simply too afraid to go near him. Only one little girl suddenly dashed out of the hall, and he quietly went after her. He told her that he also disliked crowds because they made people think there was something wrong with him. He asked why this little one had run away. Even these words, however, failed to soften her heart. It was then that Vicar remembered Ayan's advice. He should smile more often. So he gently repeated her name and offered a genuine smile. Perry's face turned beet red, and she ran off again. The protagonist could only wonder, am I really that frightening? Dolores was surprised to see this warm side of Vicar, as he usually appeared so cold. She explained that Perry's heart was broken. The girl had withdrawn into herself out of grief and had eventually stopped speaking. At first, the volunteers tried to stay by her side, but eventually their busy schedules pulled them away, and they simply disappeared. Perhaps she was just weary of saying goodbye. And then Vicar saw something that made his blood run cold. He abruptly clamped his hand over Dolores's mouth. Quitley was walking down the hallway discussing cleansing with some wealthy man. Vicar silently prayed that the saint wouldn't make a sound. He didn't need anything more to recognize the same stench he had encountered at the academy. And that could only mean one thing. One of the 10 elite corps was standing before them. Dolores could no longer put up with this clandestine observation, but then their worst fear was realized. They had been discovered. The students were, of course, terrified, having been found out so unexpectedly. Vicar, however, was frightened by something else entirely, the same stench that emanated from the demon's personal guard. Quitley was genuinely surprised to find St. Dolores in such a place, and the demon, as it approached Vicar, immediately identified him as a volunteer. Behind his dark glasses, he hadn't initially noticed how handsome his face was, and he had almost resolved to add this young man to his collection. But he was occupied at the moment. Dolores was seething with anger and immediately confronted Vicar, demanding an explanation. He offered a curt apology and promised that nothing like this would happen again. The saint was shocked. It was the first time she had seen him so agitated. This scene, however, produced a crucial result. Vicar now knew that Quitley was always accompanied by a guard, and one of those guards was the same one he had seen during the explosion. His scent left no room for doubt. It was a Phoebo. This implied that the other guards were also of a high rank. If he wanted to get to Quitley, he would first need to take out 4 guards. For now, it was back to volunteer work. Vicar performed his monotonous tasks, which allowed him to quietly formulate his plan. And his friends, proud of him, followed his lead. All the children were playing without a care in the world, except for Perry. She remained by herself, and Vicar couldn't let it be. He brought her a ball, a favorite toy among the children of the Balak tribe. It wasn't exactly a ball, however. It looked more like an egg from Madame Octopus that was on the verge of hatching. But Perry was happy, and that was all that mattered. Sinclair was observing Vicar at this moment. She had no doubt that he was a genuinely good person. That was why she had come. She wanted to be closer to him. Their warm moment, however, was suddenly ruined by a mishap. The ball, or rather the spider egg, fell into the sewer. The young man told Perry not to worry, but the girl was on the verge of tears. At that moment, Dolores was also thinking about Vicar. Her initial impression of him had not been favorable at all. He was too harsh and closed off. After speaking with other students, however, she realized he offered help wherever it was needed. He had earned their respect, so the issue was clearly her own biased perception. Perhaps he had even learned of her conflict with Quitley and had covered for her. This certainly warranted an apology. Just as she was about to offer one, however, she witnessed a rather startling scene. After removing his clothes, Vicar leaped into the sewer without a second's hesitation. A few moments passed, and the ball was recovered. Perry no longer had any reason to feel guilty. The girl stood there in shock. But no one was more shocked than Perry herself. At last, the final day of volunteering had come. Over this period, Vicar and Perry had grown noticeably closer. The girl was grateful that he was always by her side, offering support and protection. Only one thing troubled her. Would they ever see each other again? For a demon hunter, however, the future is far too uncertain. He couldn't offer her any guarantees. And yet he whispered quietly that if a tomorrow came for him, he would definitely return. These words brought a radiant smile to Perry's face. Quitley himself made an appearance at the farewell ceremony. As always, the man skillfully manipulated emotions, speaking of the poor children and compelling everyone present to believe his every word. This time, however, he was escorted by all 4 of his guards. It became clear that setting an ambush would be more challenging than he had anticipated. Vicar, however, was not prepared to wait any longer. The hunt for the elite corpse would commence that night. Yet something else was bothering him. Sinclair's behavior had aroused his suspicion. At the academy, she came across as simple and approachable. But Vicar remembered distinctly that in his past life, she had been a legend of the Ice Squad. She had placed first in both final examinations, but had vanished without a trace immediately after graduation, never to be seen again. In the meantime, the children were being allowed to bid farewell to the volunteers. Perry, however, was nowhere to be found. The young man searched the entire courtyard, but to no avail. Worried, he went to find Dolores. When the saint saw him, she was immediately reminded of all the bright moments she associated with this cold, yet genuine young man. She, too, was surprised by Perry's absence. She had seen her in high spirits earlier that morning. Everything clicked into place in Vicar's mind. This was the work of a demon. Quitley's guards had been given a specific assignment to maintain a perimeter around their master. Vicar, however, seized an opportunity and approached Phoebo. His question was strange and unexpected. It was impossible to get a response, however, as the servants were not permitted to speak. So Vicar decided not to waste any more time. Phoebo's head instantly disintegrated as if it had been made of cloth. The young man could not believe his eyes. The demon servant he had just killed bore a striking resemblance to Pedro from the Cuevadas family. And while the face had some minor differences, like the moles, the similarity was uncanny. The protagonist recalled how, in a past life, Pedro had spoken of his younger brother who had vanished during isolated training. It was quite plausible, then, that the demon's other servants were also once people he knew. At that moment, the creatures launched their attack. The ensuing battle was a difficult one. Meanwhile, Dolores was whispering prayers to the Almighty. Her thoughts, however, kept returning to a single image, Vicar. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself he was just a younger comrade. But something about him and about the Nighthound sat uncomfortably in her mind. Suddenly, the adjacent hallway was rocked by a series of explosions. It was the Night Hound, engaged in combat with Quitley's guards. Everything transpired so quickly that Dolores had no time to process what was happening. The girl's presence distracted him for a crucial moment, and he missed the shot. She screamed at the guards to cease this madness, but her words had no effect. Only Vicar, who remained on his feet, asked her to move aside and absorbed all the blows himself. Dolores could not conceal her distress at the Hound's injury, but Vicar quickly dispatched his foes. As soon as the battle was over, the faces of the slain guards changed. They no longer resembled the guards. He explained that they were undead, masquerading as other people. One of his opponents was the same officer who had been with Vikir on the day he disappeared. This warrior had avoided issues within his own family by undertaking isolated training. It was a story similar to Seth's. And if the Morgue triplets weren't lying, then could she really be here too? The future legend, Camus Morgue. Dolores was in awe. The Night Hound had rescued her yet again. She too served God and possessed the ability to destroy the undead. But Vicar asked her to leave. He needed to verify something. Standing before him was a girl with long red hair. Her magic was at least of the sixth circle. Even for the Morgue family, such power at a young age was exceptionally rare. Could it really be her? In his past life, Camus had a warm relationship with her uncle. If he hadn't just approached her then, if he hadn't used her for his own ends, if his actions now had ruined her destiny again, the destiny of the hero Camus Morgue, then what damage had he caused? The young man finally closed the distance to his enemy. He violently tore the mask from its face, and without a second thought, he severed its head. Dolores immediately rushed to the Hound's aid. She couldn't tell if this girl was someone he knew. Fortunately, he had simply been mistaken. But a question lingered in Dolores' mind. Why had he fought until his very last breath? The young man replied, "It was a demon hunt." Astonished, she watched in silence as he gathered the servant's mask. A voice then emerged from the darkness, demanding the return of the relics. The mask, the voice claimed, had been borrowed from a very malevolent lady. The voice undoubtedly belonged to Quitley. A mouth that had sprouted on the body of one of the servants ominously declared that the saint now knew everything. Dolores could take no more. She began to pray with all her heart. The divine power obliterated the horrifying creature in an instant. This, however, was only the beginning. A blow pierced Vicar clean through. The demon questioned if the saint was truly prepared to fight him. Young, inexperienced, with only a modest swordsman as a partner, who was she attempting to deceive? But even if her bravery was just an act, he wouldn't fall for it. And yet the demon was pleased. The saint was finally within his grasp. Vicar then realized something critical. This demon was a coward. He never fought alone, always using his servants as shields. The hero thus easily healed his wounds and, smiling, asked how his acting had been. The demon simply sighed and told the damned actor to call him Dantalion. Surprisingly, even such a severe blow to the head had not killed the creature. Vicar understood perfectly well that Dantalion was a member of the 10 Elite Corps for a reason. This demon gathered faces, and with them, he collected lives, memories, and emotions. Until this entire collection was eradicated, killing him would be impossible. But Vicar was merciless, and he was determined to do just that. A woman's body lay on the floor, but another form was already taking shape from it. This time, a man. Dantalion expertly manipulated emotions, shifting his appearance to throw his adversary off balance. And once he had succeeded, he pressed one of the faces into Vicar's hand. He called it a gift. The hero felt as if he had been struck by lightning as the memories, pain, and traumas of others flooded his consciousness. Vicar's own memories began to blend with the stranger's identity, blurring the distinction between himself and someone else. The protagonist acted without hesitation. He severed his own hand. And the power of the salamander immediately began the healing process, returning his body to its normal state. Now the demon understood why Andromelius had been defeated. A direct confrontation with such an opponent would not be possible. So he shifted his focus to Dolores. He could see that the saint was the Night Hound's weak point. She herself insisted that he not worry about her, but Vicar could not risk losing the person who served as a pillar for the heroes. This battle was far too brutal. If things were always to be this way, the Hound would have to continue fighting alone. Dolores had to summon her courage, but fear held her paralyzed. And yet she knew she had no right to let him fight alone. Dantalion attempted to shatter her faith, to intimidate her and crush her from within. Meanwhile, Vicar continued to fight. Amidst the swirling mass of faces, he suddenly recognized Perry. And this brief, almost imperceptible moment of weakness proved to be fatal. The young man found himself in a strange, unsettling space. A large group of children was seated before him. The last thing he remembered was being completely consumed by Dantalion's power. It seemed these children had met the same fate. They had all been swallowed by the demon. A slow horror began to creep under his skin as the trauma, fear, and painful memories of the victims washed over him. But Vicar was not about to give up. He had a goal: to find Perry. Meanwhile, Dolores had also found herself within this cruel illusion. She understood at once. All these children were merely fragments of souls, torn asunder and held captive in darkness. The mere thought of it made her feel ill. Dantalion was watching her. His words dripped like poison. He claimed that even a saint is not without impurity, that she had just been lucky enough to receive a blessing. In her soul, she was powerless and weak. And without her help, he wouldn't have been able to trap the swordsman in this dungeon. Dolores conceded that everything he said was true. But she added, people possess the power of faith, and this faith does not waver, even as the world around them shatters. Dantalion was stunned. Where had this divine power come from? Had she not been corrupted by his defilement? On the contrary. Dolores finally realized how hesitant she had been before. But not anymore. She would not allow the Nighthound to fight on his own. The saint had to unleash everything she was capable of. The demon already sensed the impending danger. If she truly unleashed her power, there would be no escape for him. And indeed, a brilliant light began to purify the prisoners of the dungeon. One by one, the children's souls were drawn to Dolores. She wept, filled with regret that she had not been able to help them sooner. In the meantime, Vicar located Perry. As he approached her, he asked himself why he had been so determined to find her. And now at last he knew the answer. He explained that he had spent the last several years hunting demons. Yet it was only in this moment, upon seeing her smile, that he truly understood his purpose was to build a world where children like her could laugh beside him. The dungeon became flooded with a divine luminescence. In a quiet voice, Vicar apologized for his inability to protect her. Through her tears, Perry asked if his reason for coming was truly to see her. She had been terrified, so very terrified. Vicar drew her into a tight embrace. He made a solemn promise not to forgive the one who had caused her to weep. A look of pure shock crossed Dantalion's face. Could the saint really be this powerful? Was it possible she had truly unlocked her potential? One fact was undeniable. Dolores had cleansed every soul within his personal underworld. And in her presence, Vicar felt an incredible surge of power. Her divine energy augmented his own aura, elevating him to a new plane of existence. Fear constricted Dantalion's heart. Had this actually happened? Had this swordsman become a master? The protagonist simply met his gaze and issued a chilling warning. Do not even entertain the thought of a merciful death. Dolores experienced the suffering of every child that had been sacrificed. All of these emotions fused with the heart of the Nighthound. Her father had once told her, a saint will only awaken when she finds her soulmate. And now she had found him. Dolores made the choice to bestow all of her divine power upon Vicar. This was the catalyst for the moment of his awakening. Vicar had at last attained a level of power others could only fantasize about. He had ascended to the rank of swordmaster. The protagonist immediately went on the attack. His relentless barrage of blows annihilated all of the demon's faces. Panic began to set in for Dantalion. Was this truly how it was all going to conclude? His directive had been to accumulate mana to open the gateway to the demon world. He had been utterly certain of his impending victory over humanity. But now a single individual had thrown all of his plans into chaos. The demon resolved to stake everything on killing the hound, even if it meant his own demise. He cried out that he possessed one final face. A wave of nervousness washed over Dolores. It seemed they might not be able to contain the blast, and the entire shelter could be reduced to rubble. Vicar, however, was a picture of serenity. He could now accomplish what had, until this moment, been merely a dream. The protagonist unleashed the signature technique of Patriarch Hugo. It was the final decisive strike. The ninth demon, Dantalion, had been utterly destroyed. And on that evening, the starry expanse cast its light over the entire capital. A sense of panic began to grip the empire. The primary suspect in the attack on the Quavadas family was, after all, the Nighthound. But Dolores felt no fear. She was privy to the entire truth. Even before the scandal broke, the saint had apologized to Pedro for what was about to transpire. She appeared before reporters to deliver a formal address. On that same night, the Hound had disclosed to her the dark secrets of the Holy Family. And Dolores had chosen not to remain silent. She recounted all of their transgressions. She spoke of how the cleanup project had pardoned crimes in exchange for money. She detailed how the most egregious sinners had purchased their own salvation. Not even fear of her father could silence her. From that day forward, the act of forgiving sins for payment was officially deemed blasphemy. She swore that such corruption would never again taint the Quavadas family. Vicar witnessed her resolve and was filled with pride. Her heart was both pure and resilient. Only 8 elite core now remained, and he knew precisely how their story would conclude. At the end of his journey, Vicar will forge a world where children like Perry can live in peace and laugh without a care. He could only hope that this little girl had finally found her own sense of peace. At last, Vicar had a moment of quiet solitude. His swordmaster rank, a gift from the saint's divine blessing, gradually diminished to the level of a high-class expert. Even so, he had gleaned something truly valuable from the fight against Dantalion's minions. All of the leather bags he had previously seen had fused into one massive mask. If Vicar's assessment was correct, this was the Mask of Degeneration, an artifact with power equivalent to the demon sword, Beelzebub. Even in his past life, he had read that this relic's power grows in proportion to the number of fratricides its bearer commits. Vicar decided to put it on to test for any adverse effects. The health and aura he had lost in the previous battle were instantly restored. Something, however, had clearly gone wrong. His surroundings became enormous, cast in stark black and white, and it was then that he realized he had been transformed into a dog. If he could not change back into a human, significant problems were bound to arise. Fortunately, the mask came off with a simple act of will. It appeared this artifact would be extremely useful in the future. The tranquility, however, was fleeting. The hero was suddenly overcome by a sense of unease as he remembered Madame's egg. It had cracked. This meant that a creature feared even by demons was on the verge of hatching. Instead of a horrific monster, however, a tiny furry ball emerged from the egg. The little spider appeared so vulnerable that it was almost amusing. One thing was certain, it was ravenously hungry. Unlike its mother, however, it had no appetite for meat. And so, Vicar had unexpectedly become the owner of an S-class monster from the dense forest, and was now faced with the task of finding it something to eat. Along the way, he happened upon a rather unpleasant situation. Piggy was encircled by academy students who were heaping insults upon him. The most vociferous among them was Grenouille of the Fire Troop, a descendant of the Leviathan clan. He was vexed by the presence of a commoner at the academy. He declared that individuals like Piggy did not belong there, and that his skill level was merely a testament to the company he kept. These remarks infuriated Piggy, who refused to let his friends be slandered. Grenouille gave the order to apprehend him, but no one moved. Instead, Tutor stepped in front of Piggy, anxiously asking if he was unharmed. Sancho was visibly enraged, stating that they had chosen the wrong person to pick a fight with. At that moment, Vicar silently approached and helped Piggy to his feet. Grenouille was on the verge of losing his composure, and the others finally grasped the source of this arrogant rooster's prolonged anger. Their collective fury intensified exponentially. They were now prepared to dismantle anyone who dared to harm one of their own. Grenouille's control finally snapped as he yelled that losers always make excuses. Overcome with rage, he lunged at the 4 friends, releasing a thick smoke that resembled a paralytic poison. Suddenly, however, little Madame began to sniff the air. She then proceeded to inhale all the poison as if it were her most cherished delicacy. Within moments, the air was perfectly clear, and it was time for a civil conversation with the aggressor. Tutor proposed a straightforward but challenging wager, a competition during the midterm exams. The winner would be celebrated, while the loser would be forced to run through the academy without clothes. Both groups accepted the terms of the bet. The exam was structured in 3 parts: a team defense assessment, an individual attack assessment, and a theory test. The team stage was the first to commence. A magical dungeon containing illusory monsters was conjured in the arena. Teams of 4 were tasked with maintaining their defense for as long as possible against the encroaching creatures. The protective charms worn by the students mitigated some, but not all of the damage. The primary objective was survival and holding the line. Currently, the highest score was held by the 3rd-year team. Dolores's group had managed to endure for 58 minutes. Meanwhile, Tutor, Sancho, Piggy, and Bianca were formulating their own plan. Their objective was clear: to provide the utmost protection for Bianca, allowing her to eliminate enemies with her bow. But Vicar had his own team, and with the mind of a true strategist, he instructed his fighters to unleash their full power so that he wouldn't have to lift a finger himself. This was all a part of his plan to avoid attracting undue attention. Hugo's triplets were ecstatic. They had just received their first command from their master and were prepared to give it everything they had. Grenouille's team held a significant advantage. They had shrewdly planned to utilize Sinclair's abilities to secure the top spot among all first-year students. At last, the long-awaited exams began. The freshmen strode into the arena, and the spectacle was about to unfold. Grenouille and his squad were the first to enter the arena. Sinclair immediately began to stand out, her actions precise, confident, and efficient. Vicar watched with keen interest as she operated within her team. He now understood why she was considered the top student, but a question nagged at him. Why had he never heard of her in his past life? Their team held out for 19 minutes and 55 seconds in the arena, establishing a new record. Grenouille was already celebrating his victory in advance, picturing his opponents parading around the academy in the buff. Next up were Vicar and the Baskerville triplets. His friends offered him luck, but the three of them were already in a warlike state of mind. Bianca immediately noticed Vikir's skillful handling of the bow. Piggy couldn't help but declare that he was the most talented archer in the ice squad. And true to his word, the arrows flew with incredible speed. Bianca even felt a strange sensation, as if something was not quite right with the whole situation. Vicar's body was holding back, despite its eagerness to display its true power. The young man had no desire to draw attention to himself. He decided, however, to use this opportunity for little Madame. Having learned that poisonous ants would be among the monsters, he knew the spider was in for a magnificent meal. He was not wrong. She immediately began to feast, right in the heart of the arena. As a result, their time was an exact match for Grenouille's teams. The triplets were nearly voicing their disappointment at not being able to secure first place for their master. In the meantime, Tudor's team took their turn in the arena. Their strategy was unambiguous, to hold out for as long as possible while all the others were losing ground. Tudor and Sancho held the front lines. Bianca offered support from the rear, while Piggy directed the situation, issuing commands like a seasoned general. Despite their seamless teamwork, however, there was a sense that something was missing. The young man knew at once that his spider was not with them. Meanwhile, little Madame was perched right in the center of the battlefield, and she was placidly consuming the poison in a state of perfect contentment. The young man quickly surmised that the spider had entered the arena on its own after their exam had concluded, and it seemed to have grown a bit larger. The hero, however, could do nothing to alter the course of events. The other group's battle had already begun. All he could do was hope that everything would proceed without any major catastrophes. Fortunately, Tudor's team performed magnificently. Under Piggy's direction, their attacks were precise and efficient, with no wasted energy. The boy was beaming with happiness, not just because he wasn't a liability, but because he was actively contributing to their success. And with such a well-coordinated team, a new record seemed well within their grasp. The outcome was yet another tie, 19 minutes and 55 seconds. The most important result, however, was that the wager was still active, and no one would be forced to walk around the academy unclothed. Dolores was content. The club had not let her down. Abruptly, the system announced the beginning of a second round. Everyone was frozen in place. No one had anticipated a continuation of the exam. The monsters renewed their assault on the students. Sancho and Tudor understood immediately that the protective magic was no longer in effect. Every blow was now real. They had only one recourse, to hold out until the upperclassmen could intervene. Meanwhile, a state of panic had broken out in the control room. Dolores hurried to the professors, but they simply dismissed her. Without Professor Sadie, they were helpless, and she should have been forgiven by now. Vicar overheard this exchange and immediately grasped the severity of the situation. Furthermore, the poisonous fog had already enveloped the arena. Any delay would mean there would be no one left to rescue. He then noticed the narrow ventilation passages, the ones used to circulate air. With some effort, it would be possible to climb up there. And within the arena, the situation was grim. Piggy had lost consciousness, and a massive monster was advancing on Tudor, Bianca, and Sancho. Bianca had already resigned herself to her fate, unable to believe that her life would end in such a way, in the middle of a training exercise. But then there was a powerful impact. Someone had charged forward and collided with the monster. Bianca could not believe what she was seeing. Where had he come from? And Vicar calmly assured them that they would be unharmed. The Baskerville family's creed was simple. Beasts that refuse to be tamed must be destroyed. Little Madame would be disciplined by Vicar later, but for now her task was to consume all the poison and shield the others. In the meantime, the hero himself went to confront the monsters. However, all the students' vital signs and combat abilities were being monitored under the dome. Consequently, Vicar had to conceal his true identity as a swordsman, and this did not pose a problem for him. A few well-placed shots, a couple of powerful strikes, and not even a trace of the monster ants remained. The only threat that persisted was the ant general. Its power was on an entirely different scale, so its destruction was a necessity. Meanwhile, the professors had already confirmed that all the students were safe and that the main monster had been eliminated. One of the professors who held a grudge against Vicar was utterly astounded. No student at the academy had ever managed to defeat the Ant General. And at last, Professor Sadie was found. It turned out the incorrigible woman had simply gotten drunk at a bar and picked a fight. After that, the situation was quickly brought under control, and the center of everyone's attention was none other than the protagonist himself. Dolores was amazed. To evade unwanted questions, Vicar simply feigned unconsciousness. This, however, did not deter the media. The newspapers immediately ran articles about the new freshman star. Everyone wanted to know the identity of this mysterious heartthrob. The protagonist could never have imagined that his quiet student life would escalate into such a major headache. The most important thing, however, was that all the heroes had survived. Soon it was time for another intelligence update from Cindy. She succinctly covered the main developments. It would take her a month to investigate the elite corpses, which meant Vicar needed to enhance his skills without delay. Nighthound impersonators had also surfaced, and if they crossed the line, they would have to be neutralized. Another fascinating detail was that among the Academy's student body, there was an individual of royal descent. This piece of information could prove to be extremely valuable. Suddenly a phrase was heard, a female voice. Sinclair had not anticipated meeting the hero of the Academy in such a location and at such a time. This, it seemed, was what one would call destiny. Sinclair was a true prodigy, effortlessly maintaining her second-place ranking in the fire squad. But Vicar could not fathom what she was doing on the roof at this hour. As it turned out, she went there when she was feeling down, just to watch the stars. She even confessed to being worried, wondering if she would see him again next time. And interestingly, this girl was also hiding something. Before he had traveled back in time, she had seemed like an ordinary, unassuming person. But after her time at the Academy, she had vanished completely from the public eye, severing all contact with the world. If she had merely been feigning simplicity, then it followed that she was the royal individual Cindy had mentioned. In the meantime, the next exam commenced at the Academy. This one focused on offense. In contrast to the defense test, this one evaluated individual combat abilities. The format was a one-on-one duel between a student and a professor, designed to give students the experience of a real battle against a significantly stronger adversary. This method had one constraint. Each professor could only assess 50 students. Consequently, the results were heavily influenced by the style and preferences of the specific instructor. Tudor and Bianca performed exceptionally well. Even if Grenouille and Tudor achieved the same score, the descendant of the Leviathan clan was clearly more advanced than Don Quixote in theoretical knowledge. Bianca attempted to soothe her friend, pointing out that they were fortunate. Their examiner was Professor Morgue. Most students, however, would be assigned to Professor Sadie. This woman had a reputation as an eccentric drunkard, whom even the upperclassmen made a point to avoid. At the same time, she was one of the most effective hunters of dangerous criminals, and it was for this that she had been awarded the title of professor. Tudor sincerely hoped that their strong and gifted friends would not be harmed. Bianca's concern was justified. Rumors circulated that Professor Sadie could not tolerate talented students from influential families. It was said that her envy drove her to deliberately sabotage the talents of others. Sadie did indeed prove to be slightly unhinged. She even permitted herself to consume alcohol during the exams, shamelessly, right in front of the students. The testing finally began, and the first to be sacrificed was Sancho. The boy strode into the arena with composure, showing not a trace of fear, as he was convinced that the will of a true warrior could not be shattered. It seemed, however, that Sadie interpreted this very phrase as a direct challenge. Her next action stunned everyone. She mercilessly attacked Sancho, breaking his defenses, and as she herself noted, breaking his will. And this automatically signified failure. Sinclair could not believe what she was witnessing. Sadie had beaten Sancho so brutally that he had lost consciousness. As a justification, she simply paraphrased the first rector of the Academy, saying that students should gain experience in a real battle. She then turned to Sinclair with a sarcastic remark, asking if the second-place student of the Ice Squad would also be whimpering on the battlefield. Vicar attempted to persuade Sinclair not to leave. To flee from the one who had harmed her friend was not even a consideration for Sinclair. The fight commenced and Sinclair immediately unleashed her full power. Sadie was taken aback. It was not often one saw such a high-level spell cast by such a young student. But there was a question. Had Sinclair ever experienced someone forcibly disrupting her spell? The resulting mana feedback was excruciatingly painful. She even collapsed to the ground from the powerful impact. Sadie, as if nothing had happened, commented coldly that if the girl was unlucky, she might never be able to use magic again. Following that, Piggy was summoned to the arena. But forgive me, I do not wish to describe how this good-natured boy was beaten. I will say only this: Vicar was seething with rage. He then volunteered himself to be next. Sadie was already rubbing her hands together, eagerly anticipating how she would break the Academy's most formidable student. But Vicar was already taking aim. Without a moment of hesitation, his arrow flew straight into her eye. When the scream erupted, he just shrugged, as if he had been aiming at the golem, but the arrow had somehow gone astray. And then he calmly inquired if the professor was all right. Professor Morg came running at the sound of the commotion. Seeing the situation, he simply sighed heavily. Had Sadie truly put on her favorite show again? But the moment he looked at the arena, even he was stunned. The students lay unconscious, and Sadie herself was injured. Tutor rushed to his battered friends, and Morg, although he had seen Sadie go too far more than once, was witnessing for the first time her getting what she deserved. It seems that karma does indeed exist. Sadie did not forget this. She made it clear that she and Vicar would meet again. For now, however, the exam was over, and a sense of normalcy had returned to the academy. The peace, however, was only superficial. President Dolores was intently studying the newspaper, her brow furrowed, a detail Vicar noticed immediately. In the latest edition, news about the Night Hound had surfaced once more. There had been attacks on significant locations in the capital, and she had been named the culprit without any supporting evidence. The fact that Dolores had faith in Vikir brought him great comfort. The worst part, however, was the emergence of imitators. They acted with audacity, leaving chaos in their wake. And even Cindy had lost contact with her informants. It was clear it was time to take action. That same night, Vicar set out for the Royal Memorial, the common cemetery for the Empire's heroes. The Quo Vadis refugee shelter was located nearby, and it was there, according to his sources, that Dantalion might be hiding. Until he investigated, he wouldn't know if it was a coincidence or a pattern, and at the same time, it was an opportunity to discover what had happened to Cindy's informants. As soon as Vikir arrived on the scene, several zombies attacked him. It was an excellent opportunity to test out Anubis. It was a portable yet powerful weapon, and it was hard to believe it had been a gift from Ion. A single arrow was enough to obliterate 3 monsters. This bow of Adonai was a true masterpiece, another legendary item in the protagonist's collection. And then a familiar scent enveloped him. It was unmistakable, the stench of a demon. But something about it was different. It was weaker, more diluted, almost faded. And the source was emanating from the Quo Vadis shelter. Meanwhile, in the shadows, a strange girl in a mask was performing a mysterious ritual. She was clutching something in her hands, muttering about losing Rose again. The cursed Dantalion had taken everything from her once more. But this time, she swore she would never again allow anyone to take her loved ones away. The girl with fiery red hair looked pleased. She had finally managed to use Ciri's ability to find what you desire most. And Rose, whom she had been searching for so long, was now here, unlike another person. But while it may seem to you that nothing is clear, this is the culmination of the whole story. Unexpectedly, Vicar intervened. His voice sliced sharply through the silence, demanding that no one move. He just needed answers. With each passing second, it became clearer. Before him stood a creature that was half demon, half human. But that other girl, as it turned out, was merely Dantalion's servant, though it would be more accurate to call her a victim of kidnapping. And most importantly, the name of the demon with whom the contract had been made sounded familiar. It was Ser. The young man drew his bow without hesitation, intending to destroy the demon. The stranger, however, was not about to give up. She immediately recognized his marksmanship and asked with suspicion if he belonged to the Balak tribe. The protagonist openly admitted that he was a hunter for this tribe. In response, the girl screamed about a certain night, about revenge, and vowed to kill the barbarian. But the closer Vicar got, the more strongly he felt that the scent emanating from her was human. And it was at this moment that she caught him. She fired a spike directly into his body. A triumphant smile appeared on her face. It was short-lived, however, as Vicar instantly healed his wounds. And then, as if from nowhere, a huge monster materialized in front of him. But even this was not a problem. The Baskerville technique easily destroyed it. The girl recognized this maneuver. She screamed, begging him to stop. But the forces had already converged, and in an instant, a deafening explosion engulfed everything. She had survived, but just barely. Her voice was almost inaudible as she pleaded with him not to leave her. The young man, stunned, asked what had driven her to make a contract with a demon. But even behind every death, there is always someone's story.